Welcome back to the channel. Today I will tell you a surprising story, when an ordinary girl suddenly wakes up as a little princess in the Joseon Palace. But don't think that this is the beginning of a luxurious life. Born from a lowly concubine, she has to face countless dark conspiracies, from being fed honey that can kill, to being threatened to be killed by a psychotic prince. But what makes things more complicated is that she realizes that she is living in a novel she read in her previous life. Can she change the tragic fate of the people she loves? Or will all her efforts only make things worse? Let's explore this dramatic story together. The protagonist observes some short, chubby, adorable little hands and wonders whose hands they could possibly be. The baby is happy to be born into the imperial family and not worry about earning money. But now the heroine is more concerned about mortality. Immediately, the little one had goosebumps at the thought that they wanted to kill her. The maids and the nanny wanted to call a doctor. Everyone is abandoning her. In the end, the protagonist lost consciousness again and woke up in her room to several voices the emperor, ordered to prepare a discreet funeral for concubine Yoon. Afterward, the maids were whispering that without the baby in her womb, none of this would have happened. Surely in the original story, her sister wouldn't have died. But the protagonist changed fate. The crown prince couldn't escape his tragic destiny either. And in the end, he died. Maybe everything he did was in vain. Upon opening her eyes, the protagonist saw Beck and Amy right in front of her. She sat up in bed and directly asked how her mother's baby was doing. From the maid's reaction, she understood that the little one hadn't survived. Shay longed to care for the baby when it was born, and dreamed of seeing it grow up healthy. The protagonist broke down crying again while Amy tried to comfort her. The maid reported that Her Majesty came in person and took care of her for days before leaving. It turned out that John Bean and Kyung-won also came to see her, but the maids deliberately stopped them so they wouldn't cause trouble. They brought an infusion to the princess's room. But John Bean exclaimed that this should not be done under any circumstances. The concubine ordered them to calm the girl down immediately. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered that since the crown prince's funeral, her sister had worsened after drinking that infusion. During that time, the maids from Chuyongdan started entering the royal infirmary, making it highly likely that everything was planned. But the infusions have already been destroyed, so now there's no evidence. Even if somehow an autopsy were performed, it would be hard to prove the presence of poison. Maid Beck begged her lady to rest and not think too much. But the protagonist has been without food or movement for days, so it's time to start recovering. During these days, Chia received many visitors. The emperor and empress, the great Prince John Wang, and even the concubines. They sent people to check on her condition. But among all those people, there weren't those she truly wanted to see. Several days passed, and only when the court doctor said she was better could Chia leave the sanatorium. The first place she went was the room where she lived with her sister. There, everything remained almost the same. But now one person was missing. Her sister's grave was outside the palace, so the protagonist couldn't even visit her, so that no one would hear her screams. She grabbed a blanket and suggested covering the girl to muffle the sound. The protagonist's eyes opened upon hearing her sister's voice calling her name, and then, right in front of her, Shia saw her crying out loud and heartbroken over the loss of a loved one. Seeing the photograph, the protagonist realized it was her own funeral. Shia approached her sister and she grabbed her roughly by the hand, saying with a bloodied mouth that it was unfair. The protagonist jumped up from the bed, startled by a nightmare. It's just a dream. But tears began to well up again for some reason. Only now had she had such a dream. Shia decided to get some fresh air. She put on a cloak and quietly went out into the street while the other maids slept. Because the guards were focused on protecting the great Prince John Wang, Shia was able to leave without any problems. She actually didn't understand why she had come to Triondan, but the protagonist froze as soon as a familiar voice asked someone if the matter had gone well. Shia immediately crouched down and hid, so no one would discover her. But John Bean was not expecting to see the person who had just entered at all. Just as the second prince ordered, one of the maids of the great Prince John Woo was eliminated. The lady of the court must put something in John Woo's food, but Kyunon didn't explain what it was. Just as the prince promised, as soon as he leaves here, the maid will be a concubine and no more errands. In other words, Kyunon plans to poison the great Prince Jung Woo. We must inform the prince urgently. Before they really poison him, seeing the maid run out, the protagonist miraculously hid and was not seen. When the noise ceased, Shia decided to follow her immediately. Unexpectedly, Kyunon asked someone to come out, and then said it had to be done quietly if it fails. And Jong-un dies. Let him live in fear of poisoning his whole life. If Kyunon had been crowned immediately, he wouldn't even resort to so many deaths. The death of the older brother was just an opportunity for Kyunon, and now everything fits. He pretended to be a tiger, to turn his brother into a monster, and poisoned his sister Shia to take the throne. The furious emperor asked John Bean what the concubine was doing in a trembling voice. A man asked the prince why he had left the princess alive, but Kyunon was sure such a pathetic creature as the princess could not be a hindrance and would soon beg for mercy. Besides, her food is quite good. Now the protagonist understood why he had left her alive. The great prince was very surprised when Shia found him. The protagonist ran into the room and was happy to see that her brother was alive. John won, took her hands in his, and asked worriedly why she was so cold and poorly dressed, and then the prince assumed that his sister had run there after a nightmare that wouldn't let her sleep alone. The protagonist lied, saying that it was true. Jong-woo smiled warmly when the princess asked to stay the whole night. Xia lay down, and the prince said he couldn't sleep and wanted to read a book. The protagonist saw plums. He passed by the table, and Jong-woo said they brought them, but the princess asked to try one. And Jong-woo, of course, allowed her. It turns out the prince is studying because without it, bad thoughts torment him. He tried to explain that it was just a misunderstanding and that the lady was simply cold. The protagonist couldn't scream loudly under the blanket. After the incident with his older brother, Jong-woo wants to visit and take care of Xia more. She was so happy to know she would have a younger brother. That's why the prince will take even better care of her. Suddenly, he remembered the scene where his sister asks for another plum. And when he turns, he sees a ghost with a mouthful of blood. Jong-woo didn't understand why that suddenly came to mind, but just in case, the great prince decided to look at Xia. The little girl's mouth was all smeared with blood. She closed her eyes. While the prince jumped from his spot, he hugged her and shouted for someone to call a doctor with his last strength. Xia let out that he should be a good ruler. John Wang's eyes widened, and the protagonist lost consciousness. The great prince began to cry loudly, holding his loved one against his chest in pain, shouting her name the night of the incident. The princess woke her maids and asked them to follow her to where the great prince John Wang was. She ordered that they must capture the person who had asked them to stop, and that they must not let him escape under any circumstances. After that, he should be taken immediately to the inner courtyard, if the court ladies. But suddenly she saw the light. The man picked her up, and the little girl noticed on his clothes. Said it was a command from the princess. Her Majesty the Empress would take care of everything else. She assured the girls not to worry about her. However, now she was exhausted in bed after ingesting the poison. Amy couldn't believe her lady had really come to this. Some time passed, and there was Amy once again carrying food down the hallway, prepared for the princess. Upon entering, she discovered that her lady was fully conscious and no longer looked so sick. Tears welled up in Amy's eyes. Soon after, the emperor rushed to Xia, hugging his daughter tightly for the first time in a long time, because he was incredibly happy that she was okay. The man didn't understand how she could torment her father's heart like that. After Her Majesty the Empress ran and worried as soon as she learned that the princess had awakened, the doctor said it was a true miracle that the lady survived in that condition. Xia wanted to ask what happened after that day, but the atmosphere was so heavy that she couldn't open her mouth. To be honest, it was scarier than an angry father. The silent great prince Jong-woo, simply sitting there without saying a word, he remained, even after the emperor and empress left. A dragon design that she had seen before. The emperor entrusted the girl to John Bean because he thought he could take care of her properly, and finally spoke, making Xia shiver. His gaze held agitation and reproach. He wanted to say something but instantly retracted and told his sister to rest, although in his presence she couldn't do it. It turns out Jong-woo has now become the crown prince. Xia congratulated him. And then his brother exclaimed that it made no sense, because she had been on the brink of death all that time. Jong-woo asked if he could even imagine what he felt when he saw her coughing up blood, and now Xia acts like nothing happened. The protagonist hugged her brother and apologized, saying it was her fault. Jong-won hugged her tightly and cried for the first time in a long time. Honestly, she didn't even think about him anymore, and the prince suffered as much as she did. Jongbin pulled his sister aside a bit. He asked her indignantly if she knew there was poison in those snacks. He remembered. He clearly recalled that she had apologized to him. Besides, she came alone to his quarters without the court ladies. In the end, they captured the maid who brought the persimmon. Usually, Jongbin was always slow, but here, he suddenly became sharp. The concubine tried to justify herself, but the ruler didn't even bother to listen. He barely took the princess in his arms. Calming himself, the prince said that not even Xia would consciously take poison, so he was just talking nonsense. The prince recounted that he had been confused by the testimony of the maid who brought the persimmon. At first, the girl denied knowing anything, but she was on the brink of death, so it was time to interrogate her using unkind methods. In the end, she confessed to having tampered with Prince Kyeonon's medicine, but swore she didn't know what it was. We believe her, and it was later confirmed that she was telling the truth. They found poison in the second prince's room. How convenient, and aside from the poisoning attempt, even darker things were uncovered. It turns out they were casting curses against the brother in the mansion. What a level of resentment. In this era, curses are not just superstitions, so it's better not to take them lightly. The father was furious and ready to execute the guilty ones on the spot. What a temperament. But they were still in mourning for the older brother, and too many tragedies had happened in a row, so Kyeonon was stripped of his title and sent into exile. Goodbye, little prince. And behind him, the officials in the left minister's circle. She stopped crying, which already raised some suspicions. John Bean lied, saying that the lady only had a fever. Were also exiled. The whole mafia fell. That devastated Xia. And then his brother added that they were sent to different regions for forced exile. It's a punishment where the prisoner was locked behind a wall so high that light could not penetrate. The only connection to the outside world was a small hole through which food was passed. The protagonist's eyes widened enormously. When her brother asked if she was okay, Xia smiled warmly and replied that she was. Spring soon arrived. The singing birds chirped happily, and the warm rays of the sun and the cool breeze greeted Xia. But to the protagonist's great sorrow, she felt no happiness at having survived. She was informed that the prince, heir, was looking for her. Shortly after recovering her health, this title was officially assigned to the protagonist. But what was unexpected was that the emperor, the empress, and the crown prince were constantly sending people to Xia. The protagonist didn't understand if her brother had called her just for a meal like she imagined, childlike as it may be. This isn't the true Joseon dynasty. The nurse asks the woman, and just wanted to check her condition. However, the emperor didn't listen and called for the maid Kim. John Wang's invitations were unlike any others. The crown prince didn't understand why his sister was growing so slowly. As if she was deliberately avoiding meals, Shia wasn't gaining the necessary weight, and this began to worry John Wang. According to the doctor, the protagonist's body weakened due to poisoning, but her health is fine. Today, Shia heard that the palace was starting to choose a bride for the prince. Heir and John Wang shuddered at those words. In reality, the prince didn't want that. The protagonist exclaimed it was the wisdom of the elders aimed at the well-being of her older brother. If this little one keeps hearing strange things, maybe John Wang should force the princess's maids to shut up. Suddenly, the prince asked when she planned to start studying, as he knew she had talent in math. It turns out Shay wanted to lighten the prince's workload, so she introduced Arabic numbers and statistical tables. The protagonist didn't want to answer the prince's question, so she ran away. She decided to take a walk because she felt a little more relieved now. To take the girl, meaning the protagonist. Now they're going to drag her away again? The little girl clung to her father. The princess stopped dead when she suddenly heard a child's voice. It was an unknown boy who caught the protagonist's attention, very beautiful. The protagonist approached him and curiously asked the little one where he had come from. The boy said he had come with his sister and aunt because his father had distinguished himself in battle, a reward invitation then. The boy excitedly asked the heroine who she was because she was too pretty to be a maid. She asked a bit uncomfortable if there was a rule that prohibited maids from being beautiful. She decided to change the subject and asked her new acquaintance, "Shouldn't he be looking for his family?" The young boy exclaimed excitedly that now that he was at the palace, he didn't want to leave so soon. Besides, there are some very beautiful maids here. The protagonist extended her hand to the boy and suggested showing him a bit around the imperial palace. The boy was fascinated by the beauty of the palace. It had been a while since the protagonist had talked so openly with someone not counting the current crown prince. Suddenly, the stomach of her new acquaintance let out a loud growl. In the end, the kids went to look for Castella that they had secretly taken from the bakery and started crying even harder. The emperor frowned as he wondered why the girl. A little earlier, the protagonist had told the boy that this egg and rice cake was all the rage right now. The little one was charmed by that flavor as soon as the kids finished eating. The protagonist decided to take her new friend back to the palace with his relatives, but suddenly, a huge black crow appeared over the princess. The boy immediately hugged Shay, saving her from the bird's sudden attack. But it turned out that the crow had no such intention. He held the bird with one hand and asked if she was okay surprising the heroine. It turned out that a string was stuck in the crow's leg, and that's why it couldn't fly well. The heroine thanked the boy for catching the bird and preventing her from losing something important, since her older brother gave her that ring. Sia never took it off and took great care of it. Upon hearing this, the boy squeezed the bird tighter and called it a little rascal. But the boys released the crow, telling it not to dare come back or it would face the consequences. As she turned her head, Shay accidentally kissed the boy on the cheek. She immediately pulled away and started to apologize, reacted this way to the one who had cared for her since her birth. He ordered that John Bean should not go outside for a while, because it all happened completely by accident. The boy's face turned bright red and he started to stutter. The little one decided to hold his breath on purpose. And then the protagonist saw the child's bleeding wound, most likely a magpie had just injured him. But it's not that serious. Although the wound still needs to be cleaned, there was nothing nearby, so Shia gave him her handkerchief and bandaged the hand of her new acquaintance. Actually, the protagonist was surprised by this boy's bravery, and the boy explained that he inherited this quality from his father. Thanks to his exceptional combat skills, his father was able to become a commander of the army. A sudden assumption invaded the protagonist and she jumped up. The boy was saying he had come here with a sister, so Shia found out that she's 14 years old, which is the same age as the crown prince, meaning she's John's potential wife. Wang, the protagonist, grabbed the boy's hand and without explanations dragged him along with her. The crown prince asked the girl if she would become his fiancée. However, she had no desire to be the crown prince's fiancée, even from 100 miles away. It was obvious she was the protagonist. Shia couldn't take her eyes off her, actually. The emperor summoned the doctor to check on the baby. Now the princess will sleep in the chimchon. This girl wanted to be a doctor. Her mother was sick, but back then, it was common for women's illnesses to be poorly treated. That's why that woman died young, which imposed a heavy burden on the protagonist. The girl was sure the crown prince would say a woman couldn't do that, but surprisingly, John Woon replied that if a noblewoman became a doctor, it would be easier for others. It was the first time the protagonist heard those words. Maybe those thoughts arose in the crown prince thanks to his younger sister. Shia is smart, but sometimes she's unpredictable and capricious. John Woo gently touched the girl's hand and tenderly told her that he really needed the princess right now. That's why he asked the protagonist kindly to think about it again. Shia immediately understood now her brother was using his charm as a weapon. It seems the crown prince realized he needs to get married as soon as possible to strengthen his position. Sukyo couldn't stand this scene and ran towards her sister. Her sister immediately asked her brother worriedly, "That is in the emperor's quarters." After they took the girl away, she did not visit her, the empress. Where had he been all this time? She couldn't find him anywhere, and she didn't understand how her brother managed it. To receive all those injuries, and where had he suddenly gotten a white handkerchief? The crown prince was stunned to see Shia. The protagonist came out of her hiding spot and clumsily told the crown prince it was an accident. Her brother was frozen in shock seeing the princess. With a smile, the crown prince introduced his sister Princess Xia, and surprise appeared on his brother's face. Mixed with astonishment at who he had been with all this time, the girl immediately apologized to the princess. She said her name was Kim Ji-hwa in this recap Manhwa, and the boy introduced himself as her brother. Now that Kim Ji-hwa had found her younger brother, she had to leave, so she thanked the crown prince for his time, but clearly didn't know her way around the palace. So Jongwon couldn't let her go alone and offered to accompany her, and she accepted. After the incident with the dried persimmon, the prince's distrust of people increased, but now he seemed quite active. One proposed to Kim Ji-hwa again to be the crown princess, and she kindly responded, lost several children and had to endure a lot of pain, but fortunately, she was able to give birth successfully to the current crown prince. That the strict laws of the castle weren't for her. She loves freedom and enjoys festivals at any time of the year. Unlike her, the crown prince never left the palace, and now it's much harder. Still, he proposed to Kim Ji-hwa to personally show her the lantern festival that would be held soon. The girl blushed instantly. She didn't expect something like that, but she accepted the invitation. The protagonist recalled a crucial detail mentioned in the original novel. Jun Bin's adoptive father plans to destroy the Yiga family, accusing her of treason to stop the prince. Although Ji-hwa escaped in the chaos, they captured her entire family, and in the end it was written that they all died. After the incident with John Bin and the Prince Guyongonghong also resigned, but there was no time to relax. What happened in the original story ended up happening here too, and she whispered to her new friend that on the 4th day of the 4th moon, she had to follow her sister if she was going anywhere. The protagonist explained that she also planned to go to that place, and soon that day finally arrived. Our heroes set off for the long-awaited celebration just at that moment, and then to the princess. Everything was fine until the young princess passed away from an illness. The officials begged His Majesty to act as this crime had to be seen as treason. The emperor ordered that all the culprits be arrested. Chan asked the princess if she liked dried persimmons, as they say it's delicious. Shay replied with guilt that she didn't like that, but instead she proposed they go together to buy honey cookies. The crown prince smiled warmly, as he was pleased to see the joy of the children. On the way, the heroes came across a shadow theater. Sunshine took the princess's hand and pulled her along, eager to see the show together. The protagonist was horrified to suddenly see a man with a tiger mask appear right in front of her and was frozen in place. Sunshine noticed the princess's strange reaction, so he suggested they go back, claiming it wasn't as interesting as he thought. Stepping aside, the boy promised the protagonist that he would always protect her from any danger. Sia smiled and replied that she could count on him. The crown prince bought lanterns and proposed they go up to the wall to launch them together. The protagonist replied that she was tired and wanted to rest a bit, and her Cheon said the same thing actually. Sia knew her brother had come to be with Ji-hwa not to take care of her. In the original story, that girl would survive. The mind and body of the empress weakened day by day. Then she adopted the son of a concubine. So there's nothing to worry about since John Wang will be nearby. Soon the princess and her friend arrived at the house that Ji-hwa rents every year for the Lantern Festival. Now it seems like we can finally breathe easy. Actually, the protagonist was very nervous, but they had fun until their feet burned. But this is way better. Then everything staying the same at the end of the Lantern Festival, natural disasters like the tiger attack. Sheila couldn't prevent them, but maybe they have now surpassed the critical point. In the distance, our heroes heard the sound of fireworks. They say that on the Han River, students launch boats and put on a fire show. That's why Sucheon suggested to the princess to go there together later, and the protagonist promised him. Suddenly, a servant came running with bad news. It turns out they accused the lord of treason. Xion jumped up and with a trembling voice said that was impossible. His father would never do something like that. The protagonist didn't understand why this happened. Since Hong Sang-jo had no motives anymore, Su Cheon shouted that he wouldn't flee until he verified everything once more, but Xia hit him on the head with all her strength. But he also died soon. The empress suffered terribly and eventually died. There were many women who managed to conceive, and then shouted that he needed to recover as soon as possible because his life was in danger. Now Xia turned to one of the servants asking him his name and discovered that he was Doc Chill. The princess ordered him to immediately go up to the wall and deliver the message. Since he knew better where the lady might have gone, the protagonist advised that they should better exit through the south gate, cross the Han River by ferry, and go around the city. Therefore, she asked Doc Chill to quickly relay that they would meet at the crossing. Then Xia asked her court ladies if they had brought warm clothing, and immediately received an affirmative answer. Su Cheon shuddered as soon as the princess ordered him to undress. In the end, they dressed him as a girl. Now the guards are definitely catching all the boys and checking, so it's urgent to change his appearance. Baek decided to tie the master's hair up. Actually, the protagonist thought the maids would try to stop her, but Baek, with a warm smile, replied that no matter what happened, they would obey their mistress. It was obvious that if they got caught, many would regret it. Then the protagonist gave her Cheon the sweet she had brought and asked him to tell everyone why she has that bitter look on her face. The woman raised the ribbon to her chest, and the baby knew she didn't want to see that. But not all the children were able to see the light. No matter how many children the emperor lost, he could never get used to it. That she was the daughter of a noble family out with her maid. Also, Xia took out jewelry and gave it to her friend, so he could sell them and not starve to death on top of that. The protagonist advised her Cheon not to fully trust his servants. Seeing the sadness on the boy's face, she promised to accompany him to the south gate. Suddenly, Cheon asked the protagonist why she cared so much about him. She explained that he was still a child and had done nothing wrong. Being the son of a traitor is tough. But now the important thing is to escape. The rest can be thought about later. Calming down, Sukyeon agreed with the princess's words. The protagonist decided to ask her friend if it was true that he knew how to ride a horse. That was precisely what the servant D.O.C. Hill lurking managed to overhear in no time. A horse with a rider on its back approached the gates. The guard did not react. He only thought about how much that silk dress would cost suddenly. Doc Hill ran forward and shouted that the kid in a skirt on horseback was actually the fugitive son of the traitor. The guards began to doubt the veracity of the information. That's why Dossel decided to prove it. Just as night fell, he ran into the crown prince, who told him that today he saw the youngest son. He ran to the rider and tore the silk fabric, hoping for mercy. But under the cloak was the princess, who looked at the traitor with disdain, slapped the man's hand and exclaimed, "How dare he even touch her? If he claims she's the daughter of a traitor, he must answer for his words." The guard decided to release the lady, but Doksel could not allow it. So he grabbed the horse's tail, but the man did not expect it at all, that the animal would kick him. Suddenly, the horse reared up and shot off, terrifying the protagonist Ami, slapped Doc. Chill in the Face called him a scoundrel and shouted that if anything happened to the lady, he wouldn't come out alive. At that moment, Sucheon was stealthily carried away. He was also terrified to see how the horse took the princess. Sucheon remembered the strong hug from Princess Xia and her promise that everything would be fine. The boy promised to survive and repay the princess. Her kindness after entering the forest, the horse finally stopped, and the protagonist congratulated him. Who would have thought that this idiot would get so close and provoke Chuck a little earlier? The protagonist explained that she would ride Sok to distract. The emperor thought he was referring to Kyung-won, but the prince was talking about the younger sister, who doesn't even have a name, while the servant carried her Cheon on his back. Beck will take the horse that Ami brought and take it to the west gate. He will deliver it and leave quietly. But Amy asked her lady to wait and offered her different clothes. Since the current outfit could be dangerous, that servant Dao Si Chill saw the blue clothes and ran after them. If it weren't for Amy, everything could have ended very badly. Jiha probably didn't hear about the meeting at the dock, so Xia didn't know if it would be okay. Surely the crown prince was with her and helped her escape. But here's what's interesting. Who incriminated the Jiwa family, accusing them of conspiracy in the original story. During the discovery of a conspiracy plotted by other groups, Hong Sanjo took the opportunity and tried to involve Mr. Kim Seong-yik, head of the Hamgyong province, in the conspiracy, but he failed. However, Gyeonon and Hong Sangro have already fallen, so someone else is behind this, or the first ones still have influence. But today, it's better not to think about that because the protagonist did everything she could. At least she saved those she could save. The father reminded his son not to be too kind to his younger siblings. However, the heir. Suddenly, 3 men appeared in front of her and told the girl that they knew her parents well. It was an obvious nonsense that she immediately unmasked. The protagonist told the bandits that her mother had died many years ago, and that she had no relatives since she was an orphan. Then the bandit demanded that she share her money or valuables, claiming to know her mother. But Xia apologized, replying that she had already given all her money to someone else. The men got frustrated, realizing that some strange person had tricked the little girl. Then the bandit pointed to the horse, saying that it would do as well. But the protagonist explained that it was the last thing her late brother had left her who saved the poor animal. The bandits were stunned by the tragic fate of the young girl. Tears welled up in Xia's eyes. And the men hurried to explain that they only wanted to make some money. They decided to leave the horse alone. But they asked the girl to take off her clothes. The protagonist immediately exclaimed, asking if they were perverts. Explained that she seemed like a strong and alert girl, but the servant June's daughter has been sick since birth. A quiet giggle echoed near the shadows, as a man emerged, saying that the situation didn't seem so threatening. So he thought about just walking past, but intimidating a young girl to tears, that was definitely not right. The gang leader was happy because he could act differently with an adult than with a girl. But the stranger defeated him with a single blow. The protagonist didn't understand where such a master had appeared from. As soon as El Salvador took care of everything, he asked the young woman if she was headed to the south door. The stranger warned that he would go ahead. He asked the young woman to keep her distance and follow him, the protagonist. With a warm smile, she thanked him for his help, and soon they arrived at the desired place, as the young woman's companions were already waiting for her. El Salvador decided to say goodbye. The protagonist thanked him, and she was finally able to glimpse a bit of his face. The man left, and the protagonist explained to Beck that he had brought her here. The crown prince felt great relief seeing that his sister was returning. Safe and sound in this recap manhwa, he immediately got on the horse with her. John Wan mentioned that a servant went to see them and told Jiwa to flee, so they were likely out of the capital, so she could die at any moment. The prince recounted that even though they almost threw her, the little girl didn't even cry. Jiwa, who was fleeing. So they were surely out of the capital. The prince, without even knowing the details, helped them escape. A warm smile appeared on Jongwon's face when the princess confirmed to him that he did the right thing. That day, she forgot the most important thing. She couldn't find the ring her late brother had given her and instantly recognized him as her brother. That's why the heir thought she was strong and smart. It would be better if the emperor forgot about the situation. But he couldn't even imagine that John Bean could do something like that, being the adopted daughter of advisor Hong Sanjo. Jongbin had a good status and was even able to give birth to Kyonon, the emperor's second child. Since Jongbin is the daughter of the advisor, other officials also supported her. If this woman takes good care of the princess, everyone will praise her. However, the nurse was very surprised that the little miss rejected the food, as she was sure she just wanted to eat. But it would be better if Songbin, the biological mother of Kyungwon's third child, were healthy. The emperor suddenly took the baby away, so she will stay in her room tonight. How great would it be if all babies were born as healthy as Kyungwon? The protagonist opened her eyes and wondered how she fell asleep, and it was already dawn. Right in front of her, she saw dark hair over someone's face. The emperor noticed that the little one had woken up. The maidservants looked surprised at the emperor's quarters upon hearing the baby's cry. The ruler of the empire asked his eldest why his younger sister was crying. The heir smiled and begged the baby not to cry. The protagonist's tears vanished instantly. Yesterday, the emperor arrived just in time. Maybe thanks to the crown prince, the protagonist couldn't hate her savior. So she crawled towards her older brother. The heir picked the little one up and smiled broadly. The way the girl approached him seems to indicate she remembered he is her older brother. The emperor didn't understand her crying. But for the baby, it's pretty normal to reject something like that, especially since they were trying to feed her honey during nursing. But the heroine frowned. The heir assumed the girl was scared waking up in an unfamiliar place. But in reality, the reason the heroine started crying was simple. She woke up in the arms of a stranger and couldn't see his face well the night before. The protagonist couldn't believe her sister was with a bearded man. She couldn't wrap her head around it since mom and her sister are identical. Maybe that uncle resembles her son-in-law. The emperor didn't understand why the girl looked at her brother without crying. And yes, at him. The heir assumed the girl must have been scared seeing the beard. The young man remembered that the princess still didn't have a name. He suggested giving her a temporary one, but the protagonist didn't find it funny. She wanted a real name, not a lame nickname. The prince picked up one of the books that were on the table and proposed to his sister to choose the kanji she liked best. In school, the protagonist got good grades in Chinese, but now she didn't recognize anything. She would have to get her act together with the kanjis. If she didn't want to be seen as dumb, there had to be a kanji that was often used. Although the protagonist didn't master the characters, at least she managed to memorize her own name, so she pointed to it decisively. It turned out to be the character for Shia. Apparently, these ladies don't know how dangerous honey is for babies. The girl never thought the knowledge she gained. The emperor let out an incredulous laugh that his daughter liked that name precisely. But the protagonist got her choice right, and even though the little one chose it randomly, the name has a meaning, to create clarity. Soon after, a maid offered the lady something to eat. However, Shia flatly refused it. The emperor didn't understand how she could refuse when she was hungry and hadn't eaten anything. It's unlikely that lady would do something in front of the emperor. But Shia won't let her guard down for a second, because she just doesn't trust people. But suddenly the emperor spoon-fed her, insisting that she was indeed hungry. Shia eats, but feels uncomfortable because even though her father feeds her, he's still a stranger. The emperor smiled. After all, the prince was right and continued feeding his daughter. Shia started crying again, and the maid explained that babies often cry and get upset for no reason. Soon my lady will get used to everything. Actually, the protagonist thought her father was very cold. But it turned out he was quite normal. Several days have passed since she was brought here. But Shia's life hasn't changed much. Just a boring biological father was added. While taking care of her younger brother alongside her sister would be useful. However, he passed away in a car accident. Who plays with her without enthusiasm? And a handsome brother. But Shia was curious to know when she would be back with her sister, the emperor. Noticed that the little one was starting to fall asleep. However, she instantly woke up upon hearing several voices in the room. The court ladies commented that the emperor had never been so kind, and that maybe something happened in that annex. Now they're talking about the place where John Bean lives. The women fell silent as soon as they noticed that the princess had woken up. The protagonist froze when she didn't see the emperor. Is there no one else here besides these unknown court ladies? Shia started crying loudly, causing a commotion among the women. Terror completely took over the little girl when one of the court ladies reached a hand toward her. The protagonist quickly crawled backward. Just at that moment, a man entered the room and asked harshly what the hell was going on shortly after the heir apologized to his mentor. The man was astonished to see the baby in his highness's arms. The prince explained with a smile that it was his younger sister. A few minutes ago, and broke into his father's quarters as soon as he heard the inconsolable crying of a child, the court lady explained sadly, while returning home with their parents. Her older sister worked hard that His Majesty had stepped out for a moment for business, and that the princess got very scared upon waking up, and that's how the crown prince brought Shia here. His Majesty also needs to rest, so the prince decided to help his father, and personally keep an eye on his little sister. Even though Shia ended up here by accident, she shouldn't bother the crown prince, because he is destined to be emperor. So the little girl hit the book with her tiny hand, but the prince interpreted it as her wanting to learn too, and allowed her to do so. The teacher noticed that the young lady was very smart, and the prince proudly said that Shia even made up her own name. She looked at the book and pointed to the character she liked. The protagonist was sure that the teacher thought it was silly, but didn't say it. Shia mentally asked the crown prince to stop, or rumors might spread that she was dumb. Suddenly, a man behind her smiled maliciously. Upon hearing this, the protagonist turned around and looked at the man who was always behind the crown prince. But today she smiled for the first time in front of her. Shia assumed he was the prince's escort. All the warriors are old, and he's the only young one here. pay the hospital bills for their parents who were in intensive care, but they also soon passed away. Unexpectedly, the crown prince touched the princess's hand when he should have been focused on his studies. Shia didn't understand why she started pinching her cheek. She got fed up, so the little one decided to take action. She sat on the master's lap and stared intently at the crown prince, who was now sitting in front of everyone. They all understood that the young lady wanted the prince to ignore her and focus only on his studies. As soon as the lesson ended, the instructor assumed that the ceremony for His Highness would be held very soon. Once the location in the main palace is determined, everyone will have to prepare for the crown prince's wedding ceremony. Very soon, Her Majesty will begin the selection to choose a suitable candidate for her son, the protagonist. She managed to gather a lot of information in such a short time, but the prince begged the mentor not to talk about it, and the conversation sounded like a grandfather scolding his grandson. Nevertheless, Shay covered the prince's mouth with her hand. He's so young right now, it's better to smile and nod. The heir promised his sister that he would only play with her. His Highness turned when he heard his father's voice. The emperor smiled. So our protagonist was a high school student, which made it very difficult for her sister. She had to take care of the younger one, and even postpone her wedding. Commenting that it seemed the prince liked spending time with his sister, the father heard Shia crying loudly again. But the heir responded that everything was fine now and he shouldn't worry anymore. He heard his sister scream. So he went to her, and the little one stopped crying as soon as he picked her up. The prince was astonished. When his father wanted to take Shia away, thinking his son was tired of taking care of her all day, the heir responded to his father that it was he who was surely tired, so he didn't mind staying a little longer with his sister. However, the emperor insisted and told the prince that it wasn't good for a child to constantly change places to sleep. But the protagonist doesn't care who she's with. What matters is being safe. Still, if she agrees to go with the prince now, she'll feel sorry for her father, because he has worked hard to take care of her. It seems he has already grown fond of her. Besides, last time Shia felt that everyone in the court of the Eastern Palace didn't like her for some reason. Suddenly, the crown prince suggested seeing who Shia would go with. This amused the emperor. Time and again, she remembers they are hers, but she can't get used to it when a woman approaches, calling her miss, and asks what's bothering her so much, sighing. Because the sister claimed she didn't care at all about the protagonist. She didn't even remember the guy her sister, since it was unlikely that the little one would choose her brother as he, as a father, put her to bed and fed her. The men sat in front of Shia and called her at the same time. The protagonist wondered what they were really doing. She's still not used to having to do these things, but she crawled anyway. However, Shia can't make a decision like that just like that. The best decision will be to act differently. The mentor, the maid, and the prince's heir were alarmed to see the princess crawling toward them. Shia decided to choose someone else. The young man leaned in and looked at his lady in confusion. The emperor and his son were stunned. Not understanding why the princess had chosen that man, the companion assumed that the princess wanted to escape, if that's what she desires. His lady has no choice but to obey her. However, the crown prince and his majesty are still waiting for her answer, so she must think it over carefully. Shia didn't understand why they were asking something like that from a little girl, since she was still very small. In the end, the protagonist completely exploded and started shouting. Outraged, the prince admitted to his father that it was the first time a child scolded him. But for the emperor, it was also something new. Was going to marry. But every time he gave her gifts, he also gave them to her. Fortunately, they understood Shia's message. In the end, the protagonist returned to the main palace. The crown prince felt sad after saying goodbye to his sister, but they will still be able to see each other tomorrow. Now, the emperor doesn't leave. His daughter Shia felt sorry for the court ladies who had nothing to do with Jonbin. So the little girl decided to be nicer to them. But a month has passed, and Shia can't stay here forever. Although it's nice here. If the protagonist keeps behaving like this, she will never be able to return to her sister. After Jonbin took her away, the maid June is so heartbroken that she has fallen ill again. The protagonist hoped her sister was well, but the little girl can't take this anymore. Something drastic must be done for the emperor to understand how hard it is to take care of a baby. The emperor couldn't stop thinking about what to do with Shia since he learned of her births. The man tried to show her the least affection possible. The emperor concluded that he was a terrible father, unable to take care of his daughter properly. If maid June raised the princess, she would have to treat her like a concubine and the others. One day, the girl received the script for a drama that was about to premiere. And that day after work, the protagonist planned to read the script when she got home. It would be kind to her if she received the title of Sukwan, the lowest rank among the emperor's concubines. But the officials would oppose, and would undoubtedly cause a scandal after Jonbin couldn't take care of the baby. The officials are now busier protecting her. However, then the question arises, who do we trust to raise the princess when the little one gets bored? She goes to her father and stares at the documents without touching anything. Shia just observes from the side. And the emperor can leave her alone in the room without any issues. And she's so adorable when she laughs. But His Majesty doesn't feel like separating from her at all. Suddenly, the man noticed that the girl wasn't in her place, where she usually sits. The little one had gotten up and awkwardly walked toward the table with a vase on the edge. The emperor couldn't believe his daughter was standing right now. However, then, he understood all the danger lurking for his daughter at that moment. And he shot out of his seat. Everyone behind him flinched at the loud noise, coming from the emperor's chambers. The crown prince's tutor burst open the door and asked the armed man what was happening. However, a truck that appeared out of nowhere thwarted her plans. Her last thought was what would happen to her sister, but witnessed something he should never have seen. In the end, the master called the doctor, but the emperor only cared about the princess, the tutor. advised His Majesty to send the young girl elsewhere since this was just the beginning. The first thing the emperor decided was to remove all dangerous objects from the room. The men sighed heavily, and the protagonist imitated them. The emperor asked in surprise if he was the only one who heard the princess's sigh. The tutor, incredulous, proposed to His Majesty to review the important documents before the ladies arrived. Thanks to this, His Majesty could take care of his affairs. Shay saw a box and made a sound. The protagonist just wanted to stir up trouble, but never thought her father would jump and leave. Hurt by her, he felt so sorry for the man because he's no longer young. After all his joints are not what they used to be, the emperor decided to show his daughter the things left by the empress, the mother of the crown prince. They were things she gifted him when he was still the crown prince, going on secret outings with her. Apparently, he and the empress had a very good relationship. Suddenly left alone, the young girl saw her older sister. However, the man thought that for his wife he had been a true sinner. The crown princess was chosen at a very young age. So many people began to watch her every step. The elder said that the crown princess had a character that was too soft, and the palace is no place for people like that. The crown princess struggled a lot with life in the palace. So in the end, she started taking the right medication. Eventually, she began to have constant miscarriages, and her firstborn died shortly after. Unable to fulfill her duty, she had to personally request that a concubine take over. Fortunately, the crown princess gave birth to a boy. So everyone thought the suffering had ended. But the heavens are cruel, and in the end, the woman passed away. The empress, with her youthful face and kind eyes, once said she wanted to give birth to a beautiful princess. If she saw this small and delicate baby, she would surely be very happy. The emperor assumed that the maid Yoon probably missed her daughter a lot. Shia immediately made a sound of joy. The man couldn't stop wondering what John Bin had done to make the girl so scared. For some reason, the baby reached out again towards the ceramic the emperor promised his daughter, taking care of her while she was unconscious, but for some reason she was crying. But then when the protagonist opened her eyes, she had been reborn. To gift her one like that later when she grew up, but from her look, it's clear that the princess loved the ceramic. Maybe the little one just liked how shiny it was. However, now it's very dangerous for her, so the emperor asked her not to touch it anymore. Is it that Shilla still doesn't understand what she's doing? The emperor is so close to his daughter for the first time. Every action is something new for him. But one day the elder declared that the position of mother of the nation could not remain empty, and they had to act. Hong San-ho, John Bin's adoptive father, went to see the emperor. The empress's place cannot remain vacant. That's why the state counselor begged His Majesty to decide. But the emperor thought it was just his business, and no one had the right to interfere. Hong San-jo insisted the princess started waking up, and the emperor asked her to be quiet. They must have come here because John Bin received her punishment. The elders are meddling used to the previous emperor, and unhappy with the current one. Among them is Papyong, none other than the prince's maternal uncle. To protect him, they involved the Jongbin family replacing the previous empress's family. Even though the emperor raises Jongbin to empress, as a girl in a world resembling a historical drama, a woman approached the child wanting to pick her up. She looked a lot like her sister. The elders will keep causing trouble. Hong San-ho insists His Majesty should give an answer. The yell woke her up, and the little one started crying. The elder and the others were petrified upon hearing it. Hong San-yo didn't understand that deafening shriek. The emperor began to calm Shia. In the end, the little one fell back to sleep. Hong Sancho told the emperor that only John Bin deserved the title of Mother of the Nation. They need to make John Bin empress as soon as possible. Shia started reacting again to the counselor's voice. Once again, Hong Sancho begged His Majesty to make a decision. The princess reacted to those words every time she heard them. Finally, one of the heroes suggested to the elder that he should leave now, but Hong San-ho believed they needed to stop this chaos as soon as possible, so they had to hurry. That's why he repeated to His Majesty that if that title remained vacant, the people would be outraged. The protagonist couldn't take it anymore. She crawled over to the elder and slapped his face with her little hand. Everyone was left speechless at this. Then Shia grabbed Hong Sancho by the beard and started pulling on him. The emperor took the little one in his arms, but she didn't want to let go of the annoying elder's beard. Once the girl finally let go, who would have imagined that the voice of that concubine would be identical to her mother's in this recap manhwa? That sounds incredible right now. The emperor apologized to Hong Sanjo and explained that she was just a child, but he said they needed to be quiet because the princess might wake up and start crying. Since the girl is in a bad mood today, the emperor suggested suspending discussions for today. The elder left the emperor's office furious after the humiliation suffered. Hong Sanjo thought it was John Bin's problem, that she couldn't win His Majesty's heart even after giving birth. The man was trying to give John Bin a chance so she could take care of the newborn princess, improving her position to incriminate his concubine. He wanted a capable child and adopted her. If Song Bin hadn't given birth to a third child, it would be much easier. Given the emperor's character in this recap manhwa, both Jong Bin and Song Bin, mother of the third prince, could be empress, but she comes from a common family, so the chances are low. Jong Bin is the most viable option now. Hong Sanjo will have to wait and see how things develop, until things calm down with the princess. Those old men with thick beards return to have the emperor choose an empress. The elders usually come when Shia is still awake. Because of her resemblance to the protagonist's sister, the heroine sees her more as a sister than as her mother. The little girl felt bad for leaving her sister alone, but today they came while she was sleeping. And because of the voices, the heroine couldn't sleep well, so she slapped the old man. The protagonist is fed up with all this. Upon noticing the princess woke up, a satisfied smile appeared on her face. Xia looked at him warily, not knowing how to interpret that expression on the emperor's face. But now she was more worried about something else. Where the hell is the old woman? She stood up and asked if this was the precious one, daughter of the emperor. Her Majesty confirmed her mother's words. In other words, the protagonist now has her grandmother in front of her. The lady took the little one in her arms, and the emperor was surprised, since the princess doesn't approach strangers. But she went to her mother without a problem. Her Majesty's mother called the young princess smart. Xia didn't know why, but now that lady seemed somewhat displeased. So the protagonist decided she had to show how adorable she was, and let out a cheerful giggle. The princess is so sociable. That's why the lady doesn't understand why she's so scared of Jonbin. It was as if something very important had been taken from her. The girl fell asleep, but soon woke up to voices in the room. She froze upon hearing her mother's voice behind her. The concubine has clearly been punished. Although it seems that the emperor's mother called her, the lady suggested to Jonbin that he try to hold the princess again. Xia wondered if the emperor's mother was also dangerous to her. She pulled away from the concubine and began to cry loudly. And then she extended her little hands toward her father to be picked up. Her Majesty promised his daughter that no one would dare touch her while she was in the emperor's arms. Then the lady asked Jonbin sternly what he had done to the girl, but the concubine replied that it was just a misunderstanding. If the girl is so scared, it's best for Jonbin to leave here, but the woman tries to explain that Kyonon was immensely happy when the lady and the emperor visited him. Just now, Shay notices that little crazy one next to Jonbin. Because of this, the protagonist breaks down crying even harder. The emperor casts a stern look at his second son. Kyonon trembles as Her Majesty proposes that he and his mother leave the room. They offered no resistance, however, before the door closed. The little one starts flailing her arms and legs, demanding to be let go right now. But since she's the daughter of a concubine, arguing animatedly about something, she was stunned to hear her sister's voice, but it clearly wasn't her. The second prince looked at the princess, and anger and contempt were visible on him. The emperor won't be able to protect the protagonist whenever he needs it. Then the conversation shifts back to the fact that the position in the central palace has been vacant for a long time. These debates about the empress tire the protagonist. So she decides to abandon her father. Suddenly in front of her, she saw women, and from their silk clothes, the little one assumed they were concubines. That meant her sister might also be here. Since Xia fears strangers, the emperor plans to send her with the maid June, but her mother suggested handing the girl over to a concubine who already has experience raising small children. The concubines started to smile when they saw the little girl crawling towards them. The protagonist felt discouraged when she realized her sister wasn't there. Suddenly, she heard her grandmother's question. It was normal to hand the girl over to just any concubine. The adults were startled. As soon as the princess started crying loudly, the concubines were also shocked because the princess had been smiling the whole time. So the protagonist didn't understand at all who was holding her. It was the maid June, and now something strange was happening. Xia felt sorry for the concubines, but couldn't do anything because for her it was a matter of life or death. The emperor knew that his daughter wasn't the type to cry without reason. Suddenly the boy informed His Majesty that surely his sister was looking for someone. The perplexed emperor asked Kyung-won what the prince meant. He explained that his sister crawled towards each concubine and then began to examine each face as if she were looking for someone. The mother of the third prince assumed that the girl surely missed her real mother. The emperor's eyes widened in surprise. The woman decided to dare to suggest to His Majesty that he hand the girl over to Lady Yun's care. Surely the princess just can't forget her mother's sincerity in her actions. That's why she feels so drawn to her. The emperor agreed with Songbin and pointed out that she understood the princess very well. The main protagonist immediately understood that this woman was a very good concubine pretending to care for the princess, showing her maternal side, but in reality, she was just trying to score points. She started begging to be allowed to take care of the little miss a bit longer. However, the request was denied since the concubine. That took Xia and failed miserably in her upbringing, to put it mildly. She ruined her because Bin is a master at what she does. The maids were ecstatic because the young lady managed to take 7 steps on her own. Maid June tightly hugged her daughter, conveying all the joy and love she felt at that moment. After that conversation with the former Empress, Xia reunited with her sister again. For this to happen, the protagonist had to crawl near the officials, terrifying them. They knew that if the young lady were alone, she would have ripped off their beards a long time ago. Then Xia left her handprints on the documents. And she even tried hard to take her first steps, although in the end she always fell worrying all the adults. But the emperor always praised his daughter for her first steps. He was genuinely happy about her achievements as soon as rumors spread that the girl was walking. They decided to keep her away from the emperor, as if she now had to live somewhere else. Her sister received a new status. She became an official concubine, and now both her clothing and her residence were very different. Was sick after giving birth. Now Jonbin will take care of and raise the young lady so that the mother can just rest. But the protagonist didn't understand how long they planned to keep her like this. One of her maids noticed that the young lady felt uncomfortable. June apologized and confessed that she was starting to think that she would never see her beloved little girl again. The maid offered a handkerchief to the lady, saying the child shouldn't see her cry. As she could also cry, the protagonist took the handkerchief and began to carefully dry her sister's tears. June smiled and said the lady had matured a lot. The maid recalled Her Highness that she had to introduce her to her lady. The concubine told the protagonist that she was Amy and that she had helped her a lot all this time, and from now on, she would also help her. The protagonist looked closely at her new acquaintance, and then her gaze narrowed and turned suspicious. After observing her, Shia concluded that her sister had chosen the right person. Before the maids poured water on Ami's clothes and mocked her, and then the concubine June called her and gave her a cookie, just as the protagonist expected her sister as great. Shia heard they were so close that when her sister was pregnant, this woman always acted like she didn't care, and now she pretends to care for some reason. She secretly visited her and gave her cookies. The heroine was glad that Amy worked there now because her sister had become much happier. After that, maybe Songbin was involved in this. Ami asked the lady if she didn't like the food, but the little one swallowed everything quickly, which brought a cheerful smile to the maid's face. She seems like a good person, but can she live peacefully in this cruel palace? Like the protagonist wondered. Soon, other maids caught them. They were unhappy that Amy was rising so fast just because she knew Her Highness. The girls started doubting Amy's knowledge of imperial protocol. That's why they started to think she could pass on her bad habits to the child. The maids acted so actively because they were sure that Amy wouldn't dare tell Her Highness. Shia didn't understand how they could abuse a person because before she only ate, they behave with the princess, as if she were a helpless baby. It's logical to wonder what happens when they're alone. The little one was thinking about how she should act now. Quickly, a plan formed in her head, and the protagonist, "My sister looks like she's about to cry. If she understood everything, then she shouldn't cause any more trouble." But the protagonist didn't want that at all. Immediately reached for the soup plate. She wanted those cheeky ones to get what they deserved, so she threw the dishware at them. The maid screamed instantly. Min Sang-ung, assistant to concubine June, sternly interrogated the maid about what had happened. The young lady recounted that when she started to eat, the lady spilled the soup plate over someone. Fortunately, the soup was cold, because if it had been hot, the lady could have suffered too. Since the princess is under Ami's care, she might be hostile to those who don't treat her well. Min Sang-ung went to concubine June's chambers and found 3 court ladies whispering. The girls didn't understand how much longer they would have to be with the princess, whom they didn't like from the beginning. They only fell silent when Min Sang-ung appeared behind them. In the end, they hired 3 new court ladies named Baek Wolbi and Suk Jua. The protagonist knew that this reached the ears of higher-ups, but it got resolved quicker than expected. Those servants blamed Amy for everything while they had fun and did whatever they wanted. It seems this time they assigned decent servants. And if someone seems inappropriate to Shia, she'll make sure they get fired, the maid Baek. So she started crying loudly. She didn't want anyone to take her sister away from her, the woman with a motherly voice. She asked the lady what color she would choose today. The protagonist wondered if she should wear that skirt instead of the usual pants. It turns out Songbin is coming today, so Her Highness said to dress the little lady in this. The mother of the 3rd prince brought some food with her. She's glad the new concubine looks much better. June thanked Songbin with a warm smile. The protagonist wondered why Songbin had come and with a gift. The woman pointed out that the little lady was also in good health. Shia was very surprised when the mother of the 3rd prince expressed her wish to hold her, the concubine Yoon. She immediately handed over her son in this recap manhwa. Songbin introduced Kyungwon to her younger sister and explained that she had to take care of her. The child's cheeks flushed slightly, and he replied to his mother that he would do it the protagonist, remembering that it was thanks to him that she could reach her sister. Just 1 letter difference in their names from Kyungwon, but the difference between them is vast. She had decided to give a pat as a sign of gratitude, and the women started to get emotional right away. And the protagonist didn't even understand why they were looking at her like that. Finally, Songbin handed the little one over to her son, was puzzled and thought the little girl was crying to wake her up. She ordered the nanny. The concubines noticed that their children had become friends, but in reality, Sia was outraged because they didn't even ask them, and the situation made her uncomfortable. Sunbin suggested Kyungwon to go out and get some fresh air with the lady since they needed to talk to concubine June. Sia didn't understand what they were talking about. They even asked the court ladies to step out. The protagonist was extremely intrigued, however, Kyungwon explained that they shouldn't interrupt their conversation. In her introspection, the heroine noticed that although small, the prince was already very handsome. Still, she couldn't stop him in any way, so she hoped to grow up soon. Kyungwon realized that her sister looked nothing like a newborn, apparently. She was very frustrated by not knowing how to walk yet, but when she finally masters that skill, her irritation won't go away. Because in the palace, it's always very dangerous, so the princess must always be cautious in her actions and words. Kyungwon heard that the crown prince liked her since his brother is a really nice person, although it's better not to bother him. But to Kyunona, it's better to avoid him. Judging by these words, it seems the little brother has suffered because of Kyunon, to take the girl away for the moment, but the little one didn't want to separate from her sister and started kicking and flailing. Sometime later, when Shay learned to walk, Ami understood the meaning of her brother's words. A dead crow was found in the palace garden. Ami immediately hugged the little one, preventing her from seeing the corpse. But Shia had already seen everything. The lady of the court ordered Sukwa to call someone immediately to remove the bird. Ami picked up the little lady. She asked with concern if the maid had been very scared. The maid wasn't too surprised to see him since she had worked in the kitchen before, so she knows what bird corpses look like from her previous life. The protagonist also saw pigeons getting hit by cars or crashing into windows. That's why Shia wasn't scared, but the scene was unpleasant to her. Could a bird have hit something in the palace and died next time? They found a dead rat, and the ladies of the court were horrified and ran to find someone to remove the poor animal. Ami suggested to her lady that they go somewhere else. Recently, everyone was in a panic, but they had gotten used to it because this happened often. People said a human was behind these deaths, and the protagonist only thought of Kyonon. While they passed her to the nanny, they couldn't hold on to the little miss before she fell. But she rejected those thoughts, sure that the prince wouldn't do something like that in front of everyone. Suddenly, a man appeared in front of Shia, surprised that she was already walking alone. The protagonist was happy to see the prince, heir, and Kyung-won. The heir was glad to know that his Shia was already walking and extended his hand. He asked if the little girl could also go with him. Of course, the protagonist couldn't deny her savior's request, so she jumped into his arms. The crown prince told Kim-won that he had also been small once. The third prince was surprised by this. A radiant smile lit up the heir's face upon noticing his sister in the clothes he had given her. Now everything made sense because lately the protagonist wore more elegant clothes. The crown prince continued to worry about her. The older brother mentioned that he and Kim-won would throw sticks into a container and invited her to join the game. The protagonist thought that sounded very interesting, but she immediately looked at the third prince and noticed his displeased face. Surely Shia had stolen time that should have been spent with the crown prince, which is why Kyung-won was upset. The protagonist understood she had to give up her spot. She has to show composure upon hearing she belongs to the imperial family. The girl demands even more to be released. She saw a look of horror on her sister's face. Although the protagonist promised to take good care of her, she ultimately couldn't keep that promise. Shia began to squirm in her brother's arms, and he sadly asked if he couldn't hold her a little longer. The protagonist silently begged the heir to look back and see her brother's shining eyes. The protagonist kept complaining, and in the end the heir let her go. The moment had arrived, so Shia shot out of her place at full speed. The ladies of the court ran after the lady. She clearly shouldn't be walking alone. The crown prince sighed in relief, happy to see that Shia was growing up as a healthy girl. Then he sat down and suggested to Kyung-won to continue playing that game. In the end, Ami caught the protagonist. The little girl was very upset. She wanted so much to escape and be alone. It's understandable that they keep an eye on her, but the heroine is bothered by having someone around 24/7. She noted that it was the first time she was in this place, where there had always been such a beautiful pond. She reached out and Amy came to the conclusion that the princess wanted to see the pond the rest of the servants. They were exhausted from the girl's endurance. Ami smiled awkwardly and decided to take her to the lady herself as they approached. But strangely, she didn't feel any pain. The truth is, they managed to catch the girl. He was a boy, but the protagonist had no idea who he was. The protagonist marveled at the beauty of the place. Suddenly, she saw Kyonon near that spot. It had been a long time since she last saw him, and she couldn't even imagine that they could meet in a place like this. Suddenly, the little girl heard a cat meowing. The third prince grabbed the pet and threw it directly into the water. Ami and the protagonist were horrified by the psychopath's cruelty. Shia was so startled that she even got hiccups. The third prince looked back and asked indignantly who was there upon hearing a noise behind him, but there was no one behind Keenan. Grabbed a fallen branch and coldly stated that he was sure he had heard a voice as the second prince approached them. The protagonist began to feverishly think about what to do if Keenan discovers they are there. The heroine didn't even dare to imagine what he would do to them. She could try screaming for someone to help them, but there was no one nearby, so it would only make things worse. Shia froze upon hearing a familiar voice calling Kyonon. It was Kyon-won, and the second prince assumed something was wrong for his little brother to call him. Kyon-won asked the prince what he was doing there. Only the second prince indignantly asked what he cared about what he was doing. However, seeing the dragon design on the young man's clothing, the girl deduced that he was an imperial heir. His Highness was immediately approached. Kyung-won suggested seeing the crown prince, who had a moment free, but instantly received a hit with a branch on his hand. The second prince coldly ordered his brother not to be so arrogant. Kyung-won wanted to talk to his brother, but Kyung-won exclaimed that he was not his brother wandering around the crown prince because he thought he could get something from him. Kyonon had finally found a good toy, but the third prince ruined the whole vibe. Kyung-won sighed in relief as soon as his older brother left. The first thing he did was rescue a cat from the pond, promising it would never suffer again. Then the second prince approached the tree and asked his sister and her maid if they were okay, so Kyung-won knew they were there. The second prince called Hassan over to him. The attendant took the cat from the prince and pouted. Kyung-won asked him to calm down, since it wasn't the first time this happened, and begged him not to tell mom anything. The little girl reached out her hand to the second prince. Kyung-won dealt with that psychopath, protected his sister, and even saved a cat, and he was still just a kid. The prince asked if she was worried about him explaining to his sister that he was fine, and didn't let Chung-hoo hit him hard, and asked with concern if he had been hurt. He calmly replied that he was fine. The heir felt, so that was exactly what he was looking for. The protagonist didn't understand how he could talk so calmly about such things. Kyung-won seriously asked his sister not to wander around lonely places anymore. That's a place Kyung-won frequents, so it's better if the princess doesn't come around here now. Shia understood why Zombin wanted to tease Jongbin. That woman knew where her son was. Kyung-won wanted to play with the crown prince, but had to come because she was worried about her. The second prince smiled and told her that she was back to that not-so-childish expression. If she cares this much now, what's going to happen later? Kyung-won felt the urge to touch her sister, and she didn't even understand what was happening to her. All this time, the crown prince had been behind the tree. Without our heroes knowing, a few days later, Kyung-won asked the little one, when would she learn to talk already? The protagonist was outraged by that question. She had been asking her the same thing for days. His Highness the First Prince also longed to hear something from his sister, so he asked her to call him brother. Actually, Shia didn't want to talk because of her poor pronunciation, so she started hitting her brother in the face. The heir assumed that Shia, relieved that his sister was also okay. For just a moment, the girl felt relief because she now noticed that the dragon design was damaged, was punishing her brother for pressuring her to do things. The third prince explained that his sister was very temperamental, and she always stretched her hands when you said something to her. However, with the first prince, she behaved completely differently. Kyung-kwon sulked, not understanding why his sister was so mean only to him. The protagonist stuck her tongue out at him, because he needed to try harder. After the pond incident, Kyung-won started bothering her, even calling her ugly. Chia got furious and reacted aggressively to those words, but Kyung-won is a good person, even if he says silly things that drive the protagonist crazy. Suddenly, Shia remembered that at this time it's customary to call a child ugly. Now the protagonist understands that she was too harsh with her brother when she hit him on the head. The second prince shuddered at the feel of the little one's hand on his head. He had the feeling that something was off, but the protagonist thought it was an adorable reaction. Kyung-won began to frown, and Shia decided to smooth out his eyebrows in the end. Both fell to the ground, and the crown prince with a warm smile said they looked happy. However, His Highness requested that they not worry since his clothes had only gotten a bit dirty, and that could be fixed. Kyung-won asked his brother not to look, but to help him get his sister off because she already weighs quite a bit. The protagonist was indignant again. How could she be heavy if she just learned to walk? But the heir picked up the little one and told Kyung-won to train if his sister seemed heavy. His Shae is so beautiful. That's why the prince assumed Kyung-won was so irritated. But hopefully the princess could talk soon, because the heir longs to hear her say many things. She thought about pretending she couldn't speak, but it seems she can no longer keep holding back. So in a childish voice, she said she'd already eaten. Anyway, people might think something's wrong with her. But Shae wanted to talk when her pronunciation was better. The next day, the protagonist went out for a walk after the pond incident with Shae and Amy. They walk only where there are a lot of people. The emperor could appear at any moment near this building. So even if Shae sees Kyung-won, he won't touch her. Another thing is the pond where no one was around. Suddenly, someone asked Shae what she was doing there. The protagonist only thought of His Majesty when he appeared right in front of her. The little girl didn't understand what was happening. She hadn't seen her biological father in a long time. Sadness appeared on the emperor's face, and he asked with sorrow. But the protagonist knew that the maid who would repair that intricate embroidery would not be happy. How could a girl treat her father like this? First, the relationship needs improvement, so the protagonist jumped into His Majesty's arms. The ruler said with a smile that it had been a long time since she hugged him. She noticed that now His Majesty looked much more haggard than before. Those old men must be bothering him every day. Shia petted her father, and the man instantly felt happy understanding that his daughter wanted to comfort him, even though she was small. The little girl already knows how to respect her parents. The protagonist shuddered when the emperor asked John Bin, "What brought her here?" The concubine apologized and explained to His Majesty that Gyeonggon missed him a lot, and he couldn't stop it. The second prince confirmed his mother's words. Gyeonggon's performance was amazing. Anyone would think he's a good and well-mannered boy. John Bean suggested entering the palace, and she would make sure they prepared something for the princess. The protagonist didn't understand anything she was saying at all. The little girl didn't want this at all, so she clung even tighter to the emperor. His Majesty didn't understand why she was so scared again. The heir called his sister brave. He didn't even shed a tear. He is the crown prince. He apologized to John Bin and explained that, unfortunately, he was busy today, so he couldn't go. The concubine understood that His Majesty was busy, but wanted him to rest. John Bin offered to carry the princess in his arms, but the emperor replied that he needed to calm Shia down so he shouldn't worry. His Majesty turned, and Shia thought she heard a teeth crunch, just as she thought the little John Bin and Kyunon were staring at her. Tears returned to the princess's eyes, and the emperor didn't understand what was happening. But John Bin's look under his eyebrows gave him chills. The maids told the concubine June that John Bin treated them very badly. All the girls' shins were covered in scratches and bruises. It seemed like a warning for the favor that June received from His Majesty. Sia thought that John Bin would do something, but she never imagined he would unleash his fury on the maids. Amy explained to her lady that it didn't hurt that much, so there was no need to worry too much. John Bin just wants to show his power, and that he can meddle in state affairs. But Yoon started to worry that because of her, John Bin could torment the maids even more, was of a higher rank than the daughter of a concubine. He didn't believe that John Bin would save her, and asked the prince the reason for his visit. One of the young girls suggested to Her Highness that she try to win His Majesty's heart, so he would visit only her. However, June was aware that nothing would change, not even if she gained the emperor's favor. Lately, the protagonist feels oppressed, suffocated by this gloomy atmosphere. If she were really a girl, a while ago she would have found a way to cheer herself up. Shia learned from the maids that the Cheondan Palace has a bad reputation, but the emperor never found out, so the protagonist needs to tell her father about this somehow. Kyungwon won't be able to do anything either, since if he says something impulsive, he'll surely face negative consequences. It would be weird for Shilla not to be able to speak and suddenly start doing so in 2 years, no matter how much the protagonist thought. She couldn't find the answer. The court ladies noticed that the lady was bored, so they suggested going for a walk. She, of course, accepted that proposal, and just when she thought her mood was about to change, the protagonist ran into a lunatic. Kyungwon asked with a smile if she was his sister, since he hadn't played with his brother in a long time. Turns out he came to see his younger sister who had been sick, and they didn't celebrate her 100th day, but the prince almost witnessed a terrible tragedy. The protagonist hid behind the skirt of one of the court ladies. The maid tried to explain to the gentleman that the lady was still too young for games, but he was outraged by that response. He roughly pushed her aside, telling her how dare she block his way. Then Kyonon roughly grabbed the princess and dragged her. Saying he just wanted to teach her a lesson, the prince's companion stepped forward, but Kyonon ordered him not to interfere and to stop the princess's servants. The girls were terrified, but they couldn't do anything. The companion explained that if they screamed, they would only anger their lord. However, one of the court ladies wouldn't give up and decided to take action. She followed the second prince, who was still dragging the princess behind him. The protagonist was glad to know that at least one maid was following him, but she didn't understand where he was taking her. Kyonon soon arrived at the pond they had visited last time. Immediately, terrible assumptions began to flood the girl's mind. She fell to her knees before the master, begging him not to do it. But Kyonon just called her. We conclude that our heroine has reincarnated in a parallel universe as a princess of the Joseon dynasty. And to top it off, Jeonbin begged His Highness not to misinterpret him. They were ordered to raise the girl, but the maid, June, refused to hand her over, idiot, and asked how she dared to disobey. Only then did the protagonist understand that she was the girl Kyonon had grabbed by the hair. That maid tried to help her, knowing she would suffer the wrath of the second prince. Kyonon shoved Shia roughly. First of all, he decided to start with the maid's education. The girl crawled, terrified of what the master might do to her now. Kyonon raised his hand, shouting at the idiot to remember who her master was. The maid closed her eyes, expecting the blow. The protagonist couldn't let this continue, so she shot out and pushed the second prince with all her might from behind, something he didn't expect at all. The boy lost his balance instantly, and the next second he was already in the water. Shia wanted to push the prince away because she thought he would hit the servant, but she never imagined she could throw him into the water. It seems the little one is stronger than she thought. The prince surfaced, and the maid immediately asked His Highness, very worried if he was okay. Kyonon started calling the two protagonists idiots, and shouted that he wasn't going to let it go like that. That was the problem. However, the prince coldly asked how the only princess almost got hurt, Jeonbin. The protagonist found it funny to see those furious eyes, but had to pretend she didn't understand anything, so Shia started crying loudly. Meanwhile, the court lady called for help. However, no one came, so the maid took a desperate step. Closing her eyes, she jumped into the water to save the second son of His Majesty. This court lady actually didn't know how to swim, and now they needed to save them both. She did it so she wouldn't get scolded for just standing there. Soon after, the companion of the second prince came running upon hearing the screams. Both protagonists ended up on the shore, and the other maids of the protagonist ran over too, so she went towards them. The court lady hugged her lady, assuming she must have been really scared upon seeing the scene. Kyonon stood up and indignantly asked the idiot how she dared to throw him into the pond. But the protagonist really didn't want to do that, so now she didn't know what to do. Just at that moment, salvation appeared by itself. Finally, the maid could catch her breath after running. The crown prince asked what had happened, why Kyonon was soaked and Shae was crying. In this recap manhwa, the protagonist wondered how her brother always managed to appear at just the right moment, then ran straight to her brother. The crown prince hugged Shae, sensing that she must have been really scared. Finally, all that chaos ended with the arrival of the first prince, apologized, and the heir reminded him of the significance of His Majesty handing over the protagonist. Even though Kyonon has a detestable character, he's not stupid enough to openly do evil in front of the crown prince. However, revenge didn't take long to come, since Kyonon couldn't openly harm the princess. He decided to vent his anger on animals. Before, he did it in a way that made it seem like the animal died on its own, but now the bodies of the animals appeared murdered in increasingly brutal ways. Shia started to worry about whether the servant would be okay. It was most likely that she really pissed Kyonon off for defending her. The protagonist didn't know if she could cry and complain to the emperor and the prince heir later, because she wasn't sure the emperor would be on her side. No matter how bad the prince is, he could be more important to the emperor than the princess. The maid suggested to the little lady to take a walk, but Shia couldn't. She was afraid of running into Kyonon. So the court lady suggested they move away for a while and have a drink. Ishia agreed, since Kyonon was far away. On her way to a safe stroll, the protagonist witnessed, as bad as the prince might be for the emperor, he could be more important than the princess. The maid proposed to the little mistress to take a walk, but Shia couldn't. She was afraid of running into Kyonon, so the court lady suggested stepping away for a bit and having a drink. She felt curious about what he wanted to say, as the sister was scared. The prince suggested letting her stay with her mother a little longer. Isha accepted, since Kyonon was far away on her way to a safe stroll the protagonist witnessed. Another conversation between the emperor and the elder Hon Sanjo, who still insisted on finding the empress, and the protagonist was surprised by such insistence. Better not to cross his path right now. But still a man noticed her, and she signaled him to pretend she wasn't there. A smile immediately appeared on the companion's face, as if he understood instantly what the princess meant. However, he asked His Majesty if he saw who was hiding. Behind the tree, the companion explained it was the lady, but the emperor wondered why she was hiding then. The servant suggested that the princess had probably prepared a surprise for His Majesty, and the protagonist began to panic. When the emperor approached her, his eyes clearly showed anticipation for something. Shia started to think frantically about what she could do for him. Since they barely knew each other for less than a year, an idea came to mind, and the heroine had no other option. She suddenly jumped out from behind the tree, startling the emperor with such a surprise. A radiant smile blossomed on the protagonist's face. The maid, June Jeonbin, couldn't disobey His Highness. The little one understood that now the heir and the concubine. The emperor, also affected, began to smile joyfully and lifted her into his arms. He called her a smart girl and claimed she was his daughter, but in reality the protagonist was smart simply because she was already living her second life. The emperor ordered the elders to leave since he had a headache because of them and wanted to take a walk with his daughter. But Hong Sanjo reminded him of the planned coup that he had revealed to him, thus offering his help. His Majesty said he would never forget that help, and could now behave this way. However, Shinjo was also considered a loyal subject before the coup, so now the emperor learned a lesson. But the protagonist didn't understand any of those secret conversations between the men. But one thing was clear. The official discovered the betrayal and now believes that the emperor owes him something. It seems he doesn't like His Majesty's actions, because he looks as dissatisfied as possible according to historical dramas. There's a theory that this old man could have incriminated another, but Shia couldn't know for sure. The protagonist thought, "We're fighting over her." The prince added that he could report to His Majesty about the princess's condition himself, fleetingly if the emperor would know what happened at the pond when looking at his daughter. The emperor assumed she was very tired after all the travel. In reality, Shia wished they would find the corpse of an animal so that the emperor would learn about the threats from Kyonon. However, suddenly they heard an argument among the princes. Kyonon argued that the second prince had done it, but Kyonon was outraged by such slander. The third prince remembered that something definitely lay at their feet, but Kyonon replied that he didn't know what was there. The protagonist didn't understand why the second and third princes were arguing right in front of her house. The young men fell silent. As soon as the emperor asked sternly what they were doing there, His Majesty ordered them to explain everything immediately. Kyung-won recounted that in the place where the concubine June now lives, animal corpses were often found. The emperor looked at his son in confusion, which is why the third prince decided to investigate. And while inspecting, he saw Kyung-won near the palace. And then he saw the corpse of an animal lying at his brother's feet. The concubine Yoon confirmed to the emperor that this was true. Jeonbin promised to hand the princess over to the maid. June. The main protagonist began to feel the hidden struggle in the palace. Therefore, His Majesty asked the second prince sternly what he was doing there. Kyung-won calmly replied that he had simply come because he wanted to see his only sister. Since he doesn't like to interact much with others, the prince just wanted to observe her from afar. Right now, Kyung-won is blatantly lying. Since there is no evidence against him, everyone actually suspects who did it. But unfortunately, they haven't invented security cameras yet. Kyung-won stays silent because he understands that there's no point in saying anything. After all, the emperor doesn't know what Kyung is really like. In fact, the emperor reprimanded Kyung-won because he couldn't accuse someone without solid evidence, let alone his older brother. The third prince offered his apologies. A satisfied smile appeared on Kyung-won's face. Kyung-won shuddered at seeing this, looking at his son. The emperor asked sternly if he wanted to say something now. The protagonist started to wave her hands nervously. The emperor didn't understand what was happening to her. Surely the little one acts like this because he scolded her older brother, looking at the maid named Beck. A servant approached His Highness and reminded him that he was already late. The little one clung even tighter to her brother. The protagonist noticed that she didn't look like before she whispered to calm her mistress, explaining that today, Mr. Kyonon would be elsewhere, and they should just avoid him. Possibly. Kyung-won had Baek take her for a walk while he went to check on the animal. Shia wondered if he didn't want her to see the corpse. So now the protagonist must take her side. Kyung-won apologized to His Majesty for causing him worry due to his recklessness. The emperor understood his concern for his sister, but everything must be done in moderation. So he asked his son to apologize to his brother for a misunderstanding. Kyung-won caused trouble for the second prince, and sincerely apologized. Kyung-won knew that his younger brother sometimes acted foolishly, so he would be more careful now. But the emperor told him firmly that he had no right to criticize his younger brother. He has no right to just barge in here. That's why those actions forced Kyung-won to be suspicious. The emperor reminded Kyung-won that he must behave as befits a prince. His two sons must return to their quarters and reflect on their behavior. Both princes offered no resistance. With crossed arms, Jeonbin asked, annoyed if he was trying to get the emperor's attention, because she didn't want him to let go and leave. The heir asked her not to worry as he was going to tell everything to his father. Using him, June responded that her lady had met His Majesty purely by coincidence. Moreover, she apologized to the concubine. Lately, Aunt Jeonbin comes often just to stir up trouble. Since the concubine can't scold the princess, she decided to take revenge on her mother. Jeonbin ordered June to take good care of the princess so there wouldn't be any more uproar, of course, since they don't have. The empress's discipline and order crumbled after concubine June met Jeonbin, who knew that Jeonbin had been there several times. The protagonist was happy that her sister and Songbin were getting closer. Young asked where Jeonwon and Songbin were. He told her that he hasn't left his room since that day. The Lord said he couldn't disobey Her Majesty's order. Besides, he didn't want to see that man. Shia decided to leave the room since she had nothing else to do there. She quickly sneaked towards the exit. The maid jumped from her seat, promising to Her Highnesses to bring the little lady back immediately, but Suk-won allowed the lady to do as she pleased, even though Kyung-won was unfairly punished. He handed the girl to the maid June and begged her to take care of his sister. The woman took her daughter in her arms in tears of joy. She obediently followed the emperor's order. The protagonist greatly wanted to thank him when she saw him. Unexpectedly, Shay heard a familiar voice repeating Confucius's words, that one should not harm anyone as it leads to the inevitable. The names of the parents will be passed on to the next generations, so the children show their respect. The door burst open, and the princess appeared in the doorway smiling cheerfully. Because she had finally managed to find the third Prince, Kyung-won understood that the princess had come with her mother. The protagonist stuffed a delicious snack into her brother's mouth as soon as she saw him already covering his mouth while chewing the sweet. The prince revealed that he didn't do it for her, but because terrible things happened in the palace in response. The protagonist gave him a pat on the head. Even though her mother shouted at him, he wasn't to blame for anything. Now it was obvious that Kyung-won had been scolded, and Sunbin did not want the protagonist and her sister to find out. Judging by Sunbin's silence, it seemed she didn't want to anger the emperor any further. Since Kyung-gon hurt her, the third prince couldn't pretend to be indifferent and decided to take action. In the role of the unfavored daughter of a concubine, many will believe that being the emperor's daughter means a life of luxury awaits her. Streamed down her face as she could hold her girl again, even after their parents died. The protagonist hugged her brother, and tears started to well up in her eyes. He hugged his sister even tighter. No matter how grown-up Kyung-won is, he is still an 8-year-old child, even though he did nothing wrong. His father was furious, something terrifying for the child. Shia couldn't imagine how hard it was for the third prince because of Kyung. Won's eyes widened upon hearing the little one say that everything was okay. He abruptly turned away and looked at her in confusion. The third prince was stunned to see that the princess could speak. The protagonist laughed happily and added that it was a secret. The concubines entered the room where Kyung-won was now with the princess. Upon entering, Sonbin noticed her son playing with the little miss. Hyung-won was frozen in shock, and her cheeks began to flush upon seeing her mother at the door. The concubine let out a joyful laugh. In front of this tender scene after that, Songbin became even more worried about the princess and her mother. It seems that the sister sensed something and decided it was better to be friends with Songbin no matter what Jeonbin did or said. The sisters stayed together. The protagonist felt sad for not being born as the heir. Since then, she would be treated better, and her sister wouldn't cry. The emperor kept visiting them and was kinder than usual. The mother of the second son constantly threatened June, saying they would see how long he could keep his head held high, of course. Jeonbin reacted even more exaggeratedly, but there was nothing to be done about it. At least Shia was glad that Kyung-won was still grounded and they wouldn't cross paths. A maid brought her lady a traditional sweet rice drink and offered her to try it, but the lady of the court requested that some snacks be brought as well. It would be great if they could also eat in secret. The girls promised the lady they would be back soon with something delicious and hurried off with the treats. Only one lady of the court stayed with the princess. She handed the lady a plate with a drink, but the protagonist struggled a bit to lift it. That's why she accidentally spilled all the contents. Sheila looked at the maid with disdain, who should be feeding her and not giving a baby a ceramic plate. The lady of the court immediately apologized and started to fluster, informing that she would go, running for cleaning utensils and bringing a new drink. All of this happened. Before leaving, the prince asked them to take care of everything. Jeonbin promised to fulfill everything, even though he remembered that someone else, because the protagonist doesn't officially have another nanny, and Ami has the day off today looking at her hands. Shia felt the urge to wash them. Suddenly she heard a very strange sound. The princess felt dread when a familiar face appeared beside her. Asking sarcastically why she was alone, the protagonist shuddered and froze in fear. She didn't understand what Kiyononagi was doing. The prince casually asked why it looked like she had seen an animal, not her brother. For his stupid behavior, he was punished, but the princess was born of a commoner, so not much more could be expected. Today, the second prince brought a generous gift for his sister, so she should be grateful now. Shia got the hiccups as soon as a mutilated bird carcass flew by. That psychopath just did that. It seems that Kyonon is so sure he won't get caught and no one will notice. For the second prince, this show was perfect because normally Shia is brave, but now she's scared. He asked her if she thought they were of the same status, because soon she would face the same fate as the bird, and then the second prince shot forward, reaching out to the princess. However, also hoped to reunite with his only sister, a little foot touched the protagonist's shoulder, and a voice began demanding that she wake up. The protagonist quickly grabbed an empty plate and hit Kyonon on the head with all her strength. The second prince immediately grabbed his forehead and called his sister an idiot. Now, the protagonist has an excellent opportunity to use her secret weapon and get rid of this psychopath. With all her might, Shia screamed. The maids heard the sound immediately and rushed toward their lady. The second prince cursed under his breath and hurried to sneak away before he was seen. When the court ladies returned with the princess, they were horrified to see a bloodied bird by her side, and the young lady herself was covered in blood. The emperor couldn't understand who had dared to harm the princess in the palace. Kneeling was concubine June. She began to implore his majesty to find out who dared to threaten the princess out of pure rage. The emperor clenched his jaw. He promised to conduct a thorough investigation and capture the culprit. Furthermore, the palace security would be reinforced. So the emperor asked June not to worry and to go rest with the princess due to the investigation of this incident. The girl assumed it was her younger brother Yoon Shun, who wouldn't let her sleep. Their parents didn't punish the boy. All the palace servants entered a difficult period in their lives. But unfortunately, no one managed to discover that the culprit was Kyonon. Since Kyonon is so small, her voice sounded like that of a woman. So the suspects were only the court ladies. The investigation caused several innocent servants to suffer the consequences. My sister was so shocked by everything that she had to beg His Majesty to stop the investigation. Such an unpleasant incident occurred, and it's a shame they didn't find the culprit song. Bin reminded the concubine that she could now enjoy His Majesty's favor, even promoting June in rank, which infuriated Jongbin so much that even the servants feared passing near his room. At that moment, the emperor appeared and asked why they were so cheerful, and so this idyllic situation continued for a while longer. But the problem is that the empress position remains vacant, and that means that in the main palace, they are worried about that the officials use the absence of the empress as an excuse whenever problems arise. Shia couldn't even imagine what would happen to Kyonon if she suddenly revealed. So her two older sisters took care of his upbringing in the end, thanks to her sister's raising, that he is the one who kills the animals. But the emperor and everyone else has to know what the second prince is doing. Now all that's left is to figure out how to make it happen. The protagonist didn't understand why the emperor simply didn't see how Kyonon really is. His Majesty communicated to his daughter that it was time for her to learn to speak. For starters, he suggested the princess try calling him father. The concubine Yoon informed the emperor that they went to the doctor and he said there was no problem, that they shouldn't worry. If that's true, the man is happy. But he would still like to hear his little girl call him father. Shia began to struggle, which meant she wanted to leave. Since June honored him with her visit, the emperor proposed to take a walk together. Concubine June couldn't refuse such an offer shortly after. The protagonist had the chance to report Kyonon's atrocities. The emperor and concubine Yoon went out for a walk holding the princess by the hands. The weather is nice, so the protagonist longs to go to an unknown place. Being with the emperor in this recap manhwa, there's no place she can't go. But Shia suddenly remembered the punishment for Kyungwon and Kyunggun. The whiny boy became a handsome guy, but perished in a tragic accident upon realizing this. It was recently revoked, so the little girl came up with a brilliant idea. Jeonbin shuddered at the sight of the emperor and Ayun. With the princess noticing the concubine, His Majesty asked what she was doing there, and she replied that she was just out for a walk, not expecting to encounter the ruler in this place. Normally, Jeonbin is always happy to see His Majesty, but today she seems worried, which means she's hiding something like what Kyonon is up to right now. Jongbin. He told the emperor that today was a perfect day for a stroll. Suddenly, the protagonist ran off, and she headed towards the pond. Jongbin immediately informed the emperor that he wanted to tell him something important. If the second prince often comes to the pond, that means he's here right now. Kyonon turned around upon hearing a noise behind him. Seeing the princess, he immediately felt happy, because this fool came alone to seek her punishment. The prince asked indignantly if she realized what had happened to her because of that day. The protagonist felt joy seeing Kyonon's face. Swollen from being hit with a ceramic plate, Kyonon still hadn't gotten over that situation, so the idiot showed up just in time this time. The protagonist opened her eyes and saw an unknown boy kicking her to wake her up. He didn't look like Xian, although he was also handsome. He would definitely teach her a lesson. The protagonist was sure they were looking for her. Among the bushes, she spotted a familiar old man. The second roughly grabbed the princess by the neck and asked how she dared to ignore him so insolently. Suddenly, Shia asked if he really thought he would become someone important. Kyonon flinched. Hearing her sister's voice for the first time, the protagonist reminded him that not even their mother could be empress. So he wouldn't accomplish anything either, even though he said she was born of a commoner. In the end, both were born of a concubine. In other words, Kyonon is also the son of a mere concubine. Even if they find out that he tortures animals, the prince will surely get away with it. That's why Shia has no choice but to provoke him. Kyonon roughly grabbed the protagonist by the neck, and the next second, she was already flying towards the pond. Shia began to sink quickly in the water, feeling pain even though she thought nothing like that would happen. She must calm down and try to stay afloat. They're far away and will take time to rescue her, but the wet clothes were heavy, and now the protagonist couldn't rise. Consciousness started to fade, and she mentally begged for someone to save her. Observing the place, the girl didn't understand where she was. The lady who gave her honey and the maid who almost dropped her. Someone grabbed her hand, and within seconds the protagonist was safe on the shore. The first thing Shia saw was the tear-streaked face of Gyeon-won. She touched him silently, asking him to stop crying, because it hurt her to see him like that. Shia still didn't understand who had rescued her. It turned out to be the crown prince, who asked her, relieved, if she knew how much he had suffered. Shortly after, the adults rushed to get to the children. The crown prince demanded that His Majesty call a doctor immediately for Gyeon-won. Something had clearly gone terribly wrong. The protagonist's body felt heavy as her plan required more strength than expected. But apparently, her efforts were not in vain. Shia reached out to Her Majesty and softly called him father, and then the little girl lost consciousness without seeing the surprised expression of Emperor Jeonbin, who exclaimed that this couldn't be left like this, that the last time they falsely accused his son in history was repeating itself. Shia woke up to those shouts and felt her head was about to explode. Songbin reminded His Majesty that Jongwon had always looked after the princess. Brought her here while she was sleeping? The boy with a mocking smile called her ugly and noisy. All because of her low status, the protagonist said nothing, and could do nothing in that horrible situation. Jongbin started to get even more indignant, because now they were shamelessly accusing him of having harmed the young lady on purpose. The emperor was already starting to get a headache from all these arguments. It seems they didn't discover that one threw her into the water. Upon seeing that the little lady regained consciousness, they immediately informed His Majesty. And the emperor instantly perked up, took her in his arms, and asked with concern if she was okay. But the protagonist was obviously not okay. She had to live that nightmare and no one noticed, which is unfair on the part of the adults. Xia broke down crying, pointed at Kyonan with her finger, and called him mean. The emperor clearly ignored it, happier that his only daughter had started to speak. Then she really called him dad. Last time the protagonist didn't think she would like Kyungwon so much. He raised his voice, telling His Majesty that he had heard Xia speak before. The protagonist froze, not understanding what else her brother Kyonan was going to say. Revealed that because his brother was upset that Xia called him informally, he taught her the word brother. But since that word was complicated for her, she preferred to remain completely silent. Now the emperor was starting to think that Kyonan, but with this little one, everything is different. Despite being a newborn, few want to take care of her. The nurse treats her like a princess, and the boy coldly asked her if she thought she could ignore him. He roughly grabbed the girl by the hand. The maid intervened immediately, threw his sister into the pond on purpose for calling him brother. The second prince immediately exclaimed that this was totally false. She clearly insulted him and John Bin, so he got furious. The emperor couldn't believe that his son could throw his little sister into the pond just because she offended him. Kyonan continued to deny his guilt, and then His Majesty asked if he could take responsibility for his words. After an affirmative response, a servant entered the room. The emperor ordered him to repeat what he had already told him before. The elder revealed that before the young lady fell into the pond, Kyonan was close to her. Since it was just the two of them, he thought he had to keep an eye on them. But then Kyonan said something to the young lady and grabbed him by the neck. The terrified elder ran to find His Majesty. The man fell to his knees, saying he never imagined something bad would happen so fast. The emperor coldly asked his son if he would continue to deny everything. Kyonan tried to convince the emperor that she was talking about him. No one can insult the prince. How would anyone born of a courtesan dare to say those things to him? Trying to explain to Lord Kyonan that the princess was very small. If anything happened to her, he could get into serious trouble. The emperor exclaimed furiously, asking who had told him that, ordered John Bean to respond immediately, instead of his son. The woman with a trembling voice replied that maybe the prince heard the ladies talking about it. The emperor believed John Bean was raising Kyonan well, but today it seems not. His Majesty is very disappointed with the concubine. Finally, after this incident, the position of empress is held by Songbin. From now on, Xia must call her brother Jongwon, not Kyungwon. Songbin is the empress. Kyungwon will be called Great Lord anyway. The third prince feels a huge relief. He asks his sister if she now understands the danger she was in that day. No one could find her good thing. Her brother assigned her a guard, or she would be in trouble. Xia understands everything. Now she wondered how those two found her. After all, it's nice to be cared for. After Songbin's rise to the throne, the palace was in turmoil for a while. It seems the mother of the third prince decided to take her chance. They started dismissing many maids, but the prince roughly grabbed the maid by her hair and snapped at her. How dare she interrupt him? The maid began to apologize, and one day the protagonist saw a familiar girl. It was the same maid who had saved her twice. The protagonist ran immediately to her savior. She confidently told the court ladies that the girl wasn't bad, and that she had already saved her several times. The maid couldn't believe her lady remembered her, but Xia couldn't forget her kindness no matter what. Yet she didn't even imagine that her action would have such consequences. Sunbin learned that Kyonan had also threatened the little lady before, but Yoon, for some reason, kept silent. Xia's mother told her that she had a younger sister who lived outside the palace, and Kyonan began to threaten her. John only cared about his sister, which is why he couldn't tell anything to Her Majesty, the protagonist. She remembered that among the literature she had read, there was a similar plot in the novel The Lady of the Court. It was a secondary character who only sought revenge on the prince who killed her sister. Xia loved that novel, but forgot the name of the Lady of the Court. The empress asked the maid her name, but Kyonan rudely ordered her to leave. Although it hurt her, the woman didn't make a single sound. The protagonist's whole body trembled, and the girl said her name was Soga. The protagonist froze instantly, because that was the name. She couldn't understand why she had the exact same name. Xia couldn't believe it was possible, so she thought it was just a coincidence. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more the characters from the past novel resembled the people here. But it's impossible for a person to end up inside a novel. It was a court romance. The protagonist was a man named Li Hua, whose life and path to the throne formed the basis of the plot. Among the characters, Choga stood out, sharpening a knife to avenge his younger sister. After gathering evidence for the accusation, he lured the prince to his sister's grave, and there he stabbed the knife in his back. This was a vivid representation of just revenge. And the culmination of the whole work was precisely because of this that the protagonist was able to obtain the title of Crown Prince. Our heroine had been a fan of this work since its release and eagerly anticipated that this scene would be shown in the drama. The girl hurried home to finish reading. As she didn't understand what she was doing in such a dangerous place, John Bean entered and asked with annoyance if he hadn't said to take good care of the lady. The script she had been gifted when suddenly a car hit her as she rushed onto the road. Unexpectedly, the Crown Prince asked why Sushia had such a serious face. John Wan asked with discontent how she could behave so carelessly in the presence of the Crown Prince. But the heir asked Shia not to be so upset even if he said those things. The great Prince Jongwon actually cares about her. Somewhere the protagonist had already heard that way of addressing her. So she asked the third prince what his name was. She had already found out that Prince Jongwon had another name. Apparently someone had told her. The protagonist's eyes widened upon learning that her brother was actually named Li Hua. The Crown Prince chuckled softly and said that his brother's name was beautiful. And the Crown Prince's name is Li Hai. In other words, the protagonist of the story is right in front of Shia. What's amazing is that it's not a reincarnation, but more like entering a book, although Shia, seeing the maid tremble, he asked Kyonon what had happened there. The prince is in another body. She already died in her past life, and there's no trace of her coming back. Several years have passed, and now the great Prince John Wong has turned 12. The Crown Prince was already 20. On a hot day, the heroes were at a lookout, and Shia was telling them a horror story. It was so convincing that the third prince immediately believed her words. Li Jua even screamed from the overload of emotions, not understanding how his little sister wasn't scared. She's only 6 years old now. The third prince blushed when the protagonist told him he just lacked courage. It was really hot, but reputation matters. So Shia couldn't even roll up her dress sleeves. He didn't understand how she could act like that in front of the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince lifted the little girl, and with a gentle laugh responded that it was a privilege of the youngest. It had been 4 years since the heroine realized she was in a book and she's already gotten used to this life. The third prince asked the Crown Prince if lately he couldn't separate from Shia. Li Hai responded that when she grows a bit, they won't be able to interact so closely. He explained that he just wanted to play with his little sister, but a maid decided to interfere with a trembling voice, the concubine. If we follow the original story, the great Prince Li Hua should be the Crown Prince. But now someone else holds that title. So the protagonist doesn't understand what's going on. Shia decided to reflect once again on what the story was like in the original. For some reason, she vaguely remembers the title of Great Prince John Wan and the villain Prince Guion On, unable to accept his younger brother. The reason the Great Prince John Wan could become the heir was the death of the previous Crown Prince. And the one who did that to Lija was John Bin. However, despite everything, it wasn't her who became queen, but Sun Bin, whom John Bin also poisoned. But all his efforts were in vain, since the king chose another concubine for the position of empress. In the end, John Bin just did others a favor in the novel. Kyonon and his mother were kind of final bosses, but here they became pathetic remnants of a comet. And it was Shay who led them to ruin because of her. Many things in the plot have already changed. John Bin was imposed an indefinite ban on going out, and she, along with Prince Kyonon, are under arrest. The chief advisor resigned, feeling guilty for not raising the woman well. Thanks to this, peace reigned in the country for several years. He asked his son what he had done to that girl, but Kyonon told him not to worry, because this time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. Except that the crown princess, who had recently married, passed away after a few years. Since Li Hai started talking little, everyone began to worry. But then she started sneaking out of the palace. The third prince began teaching his sister to trace Chinese characters and read them. But Shay didn't want to learn actually studying. Isn't that bad? She just doesn't know how hard she should try. A servant approached the crown prince and informed him it was time to leave. Leah went down to her sister and explained. She had to go work for the third prince. It amused Shia that she continued to act like a saint in front of the heir. The protagonist exclaimed that they were the same and ran off. Jongbin followed her and asked annoyed, couldn't she show a little decorum? They finally managed to escape from the servants. The protagonist learned that lately. Her brother has been focusing a lot on studying. Li Huano understood where those rumors were coming from, and the little one told her that there are no secrets in the palace. Shia assumed it was all because of his majesty. The prince confirmed her words since when he wanted to learn martial arts. The protagonist froze, not understanding what the hell was happening with that guy. John Bin started explaining to his son. His mother became a bit anxious. It seems the empress fears that the great Prince Jongwon would be seen as a threat to the heir. Moreover, the protagonist learned that the election for the crown princess would be held soon to avoid worrying her mother. The third prince decided to discreetly focus on studying for now. Some time passed and boredom started to take over the protagonist. If the lady was sad, Chogapan suggested to the princess to play a game. Being born into the imperial family is fun, but compared to her previous life, there aren't as many distractions. Shia decided to bring sweets to her father and brother. They would surely be very happy. The protagonist came up with an idea to carry all this out. So she suggested to the servant to go to the bakery, where they prepare various desserts, including sweets and cold dishes. Thus began the preparation of Shia's dessert. After a while, the delicate pudding was ready. The protagonist failed several times due to the fire, but in the end it turned out just as she wanted. Concubine Yoon tasted the dessert and admitted she never thought that combination of ingredients could be delicious. Shia mentioned that she didn't even know how many times she tried to make it that smooth, that he should treat the heir well because he is still young. The prince agreed with his mother. And as soon as she succeeded, she immediately ran to her mother. She was stunned to see the change in her mother's face. The woman covered her mouth, her gaze became agitated. But the next instant, a smile appeared on the concubine's face, and she told her daughter that nothing serious had happened to her. Due to the eggs, the dessert had a strange raw taste, so the concubine suggested her daughter add a bit of fruit syrup. When Yoon lived in the women's quarters, she secretly prepared sweets and shared them with her friends. In her childhood, sweets were a dream, so the heroine would steal treats from the women's quarters. She had no family and wandered from house to house of relatives, until she ended up in the palace's service. Contact with her relatives soon cut off, but she did have a close friend. More than family. When her relatives had no food, she secretly shared her ration with Yuna. Even if she had to go hungry one day, her friend promised to grow up, earn money, and come back to feed her until she was full. But then she disappeared. Later, Yoon also entered the palace as a servant. Without fulfilling his promise to meet her one day, a man arrived at the palace and pretended to be her cousin, and a woman watches her as if she were her boss. It's obvious that the protagonist doesn't have a very noble background, the life of a daughter born of an imperial concubine. But she reminded him that on the street he couldn't call her that. During the Joseon dynasty, the emperor's children were born from concubines. Shia wondered if there was some kind of affection between them. June strictly forbade the young lady. For mentioning the topic again, the heroine recalled that when June was a lady of the palace, someone pretended to be a relative and came to the palace. Shia was very happy to see her older brother. He, along with his companion, greeted the young lady. The protagonist explained to the crown prince that she had prepared something delicious and wanted to take it to Empress Ali, which also piqued his curiosity. Curious about what Shia had prepared, she promised to invite him next time, and the prince nodded. Telling him that now he was going to practice archery, the crown prince promised to teach his sister too. As soon as she grew a little more, the protagonist was happy and said she should start learning some skills from childhood. It wasn't so bad. Li Hei was going to go archery with the great Prince John Wang, but it turned out he wouldn't be able to today. As soon as the protagonist entered the palace, she heard shouting between the empress and the third prince. Zia realized she had chosen the worst possible moment. She was about to leave when the third prince rushed out of his mother's office without saying a word, and everyone had to consider the empress as their mother. Suddenly, Jonggun innocently asked his mom. The protagonist entered the empress's office and greeted her highness. Songbin was delighted and asked the young lady to come in. Shia offered the woman her dessert, and the empress immediately appreciated its soft sweetness. The protagonist mentioned she planned to study little by little. To make it safe, the empress knew that the princess was still learning to write too. Shia confirmed her words and mentioned that the crown prince promised to teach her how to ride a horse and shoot arrows upon noticing the empress's strange reaction. The heroine asked if that was impossible. Songbin didn't allow her son to learn that, so she couldn't simply permit it for the princess. She tried to explain that it was dangerous, but the protagonist replied that there would be many guards with the crown prince. That's why Shia chose to ask His Majesty if the great Prince Jongwoo could also study. Li Hua was sitting by the edge of the pond. When the protagonist found him, she had no doubt that her sister had heard everything since their mother became empress. The prince thought she had become colder since Shia had obtained His Majesty's permission. She proposed to her brother to go learn archery, and horseback riding. Liwa couldn't understand how Shia had managed such a thing. The protagonist responded with a smile. Why they had given him that thing? The concubine begged the prince to be careful with his words. That was the power of bribery. The crown prince asked his sister not to get distracted and to focus on the horse. Shia felt no fear because she couldn't lose against the great Prince Jonggu, who was visibly terrified. Li Hua exclaimed that she feared absolutely nothing. Luckily, he wasn't the crown prince. He couldn't govern a country with that naivety and think. That innocent boy became so cold and distant in the novel. Wow, the environment does influence, but now the great prince has no chance of meeting the protagonist of the novel. She was supposed to coincidentally meet Li Hua upon arriving at the palace to introduce herself to the empress as a potential princess. However, now that girl is too young. Shia wondered if because of her the protagonists wouldn't meet, although maybe it's better that they don't. That way she would live a peaceful and uneventful life. After class, the crown prince accompanied the princess. The protagonist was worried that the heir had time for that, with the servants following them so tense. The protagonist began to suspect that her older brother took his games as a day off, since that girl is still his sister. In the end, Jonggon agreed. The prince headed for the exit, although she also liked spending time with him after the punishment order was given. John Bean and John Gong were locked up and sometimes screamed like they were possessed. The crown prince decided to go visit them, but the protagonist had no intention of visiting those she disliked. Li Hai had to do things as crown prince even if he disliked them. But Shia was free to choose. The protagonist heard the screams again, and the crown prince covered her ears so the little one wouldn't hear anything. When the sound ceased, Li He asked her sister to eat well, to see only good things and think positively, and then went to visit her brother since Li He is a maternal relative. She must visit and keep an eye on his life from time to time. Shortly after, she learned that she would soon have a younger brother or sister. That's why, when Mom tried the pudding for the first time, something fell off and it turns out it was morning sickness. The protagonist was curious to know if it would be a girl or a boy. Maybe they would be born looking exactly like the protagonist's younger brother named Yoon Shibun Shia decided to personally congratulate her mother and announce that he had to leave. The door closed and the protagonist felt relieved but wondered what she was going to do now. The maids asked the lady how everything went since Her Highness was probably very happy. The protagonist confirmed these words. Just then, Xia noticed something was wrong with Baek, because he looked a bit off. It turns out the maid simply didn't understand why people in the prince's heir's palace were so rude the prince's personal maid ordered to keep an eye on her smile. The protagonist rolled her eyes, because the people in the East Palace hated her. Even today, they looked at her with hostility. But how is it possible that even her maids were bothered? Of course, Shia couldn't just stand there since she had a brilliant idea. The heroine offered the crown prince a dessert that the queen had gifted her last time a liege became curious, wondering if she had already offered that to her father. She responded negatively, which meant that the prince tasted the dish long before his father. The protagonist explained that the dish needed a more thorough test. The crown prince asked if his father wouldn't mind. Suddenly, the princess revealed that many say he behaves frivolously. It seems that Mr. Guiyonggon feels uncomfortable with the appearance of Miss after the empress's death. Frowning, the crown prince asked seriously if Sang-eung had said anything. Shia expected it, but didn't think the prince would get so mad. Now read Hey. She was starting to doubt if she had the right to be the crown prince. However, everything was completely different. The prince wasn't like this before. That's why the protagonist didn't understand why she was suddenly thinking so negatively. She abruptly stood up and asked if anything else had happened yesterday after seeing the second prince. Lehigh didn't respond, but the protagonist knew how tired the crown prince was. He immediately started to hug the protagonist. Soon he would have to take a princess as a wife. It had been so long since his mother passed away, but he still didn't want to bring another woman home. If he hadn't become crown prince, maybe he wouldn't suffer so much or die so young. Shia asked her brother if he wanted to gift her something. Their father still kept the ring he gifted to the princess when he was crown prince. The protagonist revealed that he bought it during a stroll through the village. Lee Hae, with a warm smile. He avoided women for years, and suddenly Sung Eon John Bean appears, revealing that they don't know what will happen after this pregnancy. Asked why his Shia was so smart, and the heroine replied that she was just born that way. The crown prince asked his sister to tell him right away if her future husband was misbehaving, but Shia responded that if she didn't like her husband, she would live alone. However, Lee Hae couldn't understand how one could live alone while having a husband. The protagonist explained that when the husband dies, the princess could start living peacefully on her own, but it sounded like she was plotting something against her husband. In the novel, it said that after the little princess's deaths, the emperor fell into despair and had no more children. Now, besides Shia, another baby is expected. The prince reminded his sister that they were both members of the imperial family, but Shia decided that if she didn't want to marry, she'd just run away to another island with money the night before the wedding. Lee Hae asked her sister to just tell her if she suddenly liked someone. With her arms crossed, the girl replied that she'd think about it. Seasons passed and time went by peacefully. But one day, the empress scolded her very harshly. The protagonist told the maids that she was fine, but still asked them not to tell her mother anything. In reality, Shia was ready to be punished for this. So she didn't regret anything and told the empress that the great prince always works very hard. The mystery looms. There were many pregnant concubines before, but none enjoyed his favor. None. So she could be a little kinder to him. After these words, Songbin took the whip. But it seems that Mom wasn't as angry as she seemed. In the end, she even cried and apologized. It seems she punishes her real son more often. Now the protagonist is in the Gong Hall. However, the crown prince and the third prince visited her with concern. Lee asked his sister if she was okay. He was sure that Shia was punished because of her incompetent brother. The crown prince wouldn't come to the palace without prior notice, so the empress knew he would arrive. That's why she scolded the protagonist on purpose. It was some kind of act to show that she didn't threaten the heir's position. Surely the crown prince heard everything. The protagonist thought that the empress had gone too far this time, but not with her, rather with her son. From the beginning, Li Hua said nothing, but Shea was sure he felt very sorry originally. The officials and non-heir princes had to study culture to maintain decorum, but they had to live under the motto that they are pure and free, and that power and the crown do not interest them at all. But since the crown prince treated John Wang well, he followed his older brother in studies and the arts, because most suffered miscarriages or the children were born weak and died. A cruel fate. Martial arts. And the problem is that he surpassed the heir in everything. The great prince is much younger than the heir. So direct comparisons are impossible. Suddenly, Lee Hae declared that he was a complete useless, and that it would be better for the country if the heir were someone exceptional. But if you change the prince, the elders will unleash a great struggle. Even if you have talent, it doesn't mean you're the only one capable of something after all. This might not lead to anything great. Sometimes Leah thinks about it, but Shia says things inappropriate for a child. It seems she doesn't have to worry about the prince. The crown prince spoke about the upcoming military maneuvers for which he plans to leave the palace for a while. They used to take place in spring, but lately they are done in winter. During this time, wild animals approach private houses out of hunger. The protagonist concluded that the crown prince hunting is out of place. Her brother is more into using brushes and books, so Shia didn't understand how to send such a beautiful face off to marry. Suddenly, Lee Hee asked her sister to prepare that rice cake once again before leaving. It's a new snack made for the concubine. But fortunately, the maid June gave birth to a girl, a glimmer of hope. The maid told John Bin. June, who suffers from morning sickness and can't eat well, finds it lighter than rice cake, which is why pregnant women like it. The protagonist promised to make it tomorrow. It turns out even others wanted to try it once they heard about the cake. Shia looked at her brother suspiciously and asked if he planned to give the leftovers to others. He looked at the heroine hopefully and asked pitifully if she wouldn't allow it, but the protagonist was more interested in whether her brother would give her this snack. To the second prince, Lee Hae confessed that he was very worried because his character was becoming fiercer every day. Now Xia replied that she would think about his proposal, but if my brother promises not to share his plate with anyone, she will do it. What can she do? Li Hua was getting angry, and the crown prince deduced that his brother also wanted to try the cake. When the protagonist was talking to the unborn baby, it became super active. We still don't know if it's a princess or a prince, but this baby is very impatient. Xia asked her mother if she was okay, and the woman replied not to worry about her. The protagonist reminded her that the roads are slippery in winter and asked her to be careful when going out Zhangxiang. Isn't easy. If her half-brother betrays her, she could be executed, but we doubt she has such relatives anyway, that there was no reason to worry. June wasn't the favorite, but it was obvious. Oh approached the crown prince and asked if he was okay. The crown prince washed his face with cold water. He said it was nothing serious and asked not to make a big deal out of it. Right after he pulled an arrow from the wounded crow. It would have been easier if it had died from the first shot. Slowly emerging from the thickness of the forest was a huge tiger. Everyone was petrified upon seeing the predatory beast. The crown prince hurriedly mounted his horse and ordered an immediate retreat. They didn't even have a trap prepared for the tiger. Li Hua and her master noticed that His Royal Highness had come to class again. Today, the protagonist brought a bribe and handed her creation to the instructor, telling him to share it with his family. Xia had a hidden reason for attending the class of the great Prince John Wang. The protagonist used the class as an excuse to understand how this world worked, but Li Hua didn't understand why she sat with him in the lessons. This world resembles Yoseon that the protagonist knows, but there are differences. For example, some characters are missing. Possibly that's why Xia was interested in studying history. Kids like the third prince, despite being held back, study the material without getting distracted. If His Majesty had a living child, he would treat Jun well and visit her soon. However, since the concubine is in delicate health, after class, the protagonist went to play. Li Chua was proud of himself. Since his sister couldn't rival her brother yet upon seeing the maids whispering, the protagonist wondered why all the servants were gathered there. The ladies of the court shuddered when the young lady abruptly asked what was happening. It turned out a messenger arrived from Gangwon Dio with urgent news and hurriedly left. The third prince assumed that if it was something urgent, it must be extremely important. The protagonist pondered what could have happened for them to send a messenger from Gangwon with such urgency. This could be something the king couldn't resolve. Xia abruptly took her brother's hand, saying they needed to go urgently to the empress. The princess looked at her brother in horror upon hearing him say they were about to break the rules of etiquette. Li Hua was stunned when her sister shouted that they needed to hurry. The little one was the first to slam the door open. The officials started to get angry because they had ordered that no one be allowed in while they were meeting with the empress, the third prince. Zhongbin will raise the little one. An unexpected twist. In other words, it's the very battle of apologize to the empress for not having taken proper care of his sister. He was going to leave, however. Her Majesty asked him to stay. The great Prince John Wang and Xia needed to find out about this news. Soon everyone knew that the crown prince had tragically passed away, being devoured by a tiger. The protagonist couldn't believe it. Her brother promised to return when he was still at home. The crown prince asked his sister to take care of something. It was that same ring that the princess talked about earlier. The heir received it from his father. Ali thought that if he took it to the drills, he would definitely lose it as soon as he came back. The prince promised his beloved little sister to bring her something better. Turns out, all his words were lies. After this, a month passed. The prince's funeral ceremony continued. Ishia cried to exhaustion every day, sleeping among tears. But one day she finally left her room. The princess asked the court ladies if they knew where the senior officer was. They said he was completely healthy. But even those rumors couldn't be believed. Jones-Yong had an injured eye. Concubines that the protagonist had heard about while Zhongbin raises the princess. She could use her for His Majesty to visit. The man immediately got up from bed. Even though His Highness had given him permission not to, the protagonist decided to find out the whole truth about the senior officer, since the others refused to say anything. She hadn't even seen her brother's body, and they hadn't told her anything about what happened in his last minutes. It's even crueler that she has to gather information only through rumors. The crown prince always told his companion that the lady's stubbornness was invincible, and he was right. It all happened when they suddenly found themselves caught in a heavy snowstorm and rushed to return. Because they sped up, the horse slipped on the snowy road, and the prince fell off it. Fortunately, he didn't suffer serious injuries and was going to get back on his horse. But at that moment, as if waiting for the perfect moment, a tiger appeared. So John Seong-oh guided the crown prince and stayed behind to fight the tiger. The predator was old and moved slowly, so the man managed to land a fatal blow. As soon as she becomes pregnant, this kid will be useless, the concubine asked the maid. Only with his bow. Then the hero thought he had been lucky until he discovered others had advanced. In terrible shape, there was another tiger there. Jun Seong-oh immediately attacked, thinking that the predator had cruelly torn apart His Highness. The crown prince managed to injure the second tiger, but it threw him far away. Under the tiger's blows, Jun Seong-oh lost consciousness and fell, and when he woke up, he saw the tiger's fangs right in front of him. And at that moment, the man thought everything was over. But suddenly the predator twisted and roared in agony. It turned out that the crown prince, whom John Song thought was dead, was beside him with a drawn bow. In other words, the foolish crown prince risked his life to save his warrior. When Jeonseong-oh opened his eyes again, he realized that he was now the only survivor gathering his last strength. He followed the tiger's tracks, and among the scattered bodies, he saw it wounded and panting. Thus, Jeonseong-oh ended the tiger's life, using his fallen comrade's sword. Later, the soldiers found the man, gave him first aid, and with the remaining belongings and clothes, if she gave honey to the girl during breastfeeding. She nodded in confirmation, but the girl refused to eat the honey. They identified the body. The crown prince held in his hands a painting depicting the great prince and the princess, Lee. He was always like this. He thought of others, not himself, but the protagonist loved that quality in him. Although Xia felt resentment, she couldn't punish Jeonseong-oh because then the crown prince's death would be in vain. The protagonist headed for the exit and asked the senior officer not to accompany her. But Jeonseong-oh disagreed with that. He insisted on escorting the princess upon returning. Beck looked suspiciously at one of the maidservants. Then the court lady explained to the princess that she thought she saw a familiar face. The servant revealed that visits to the medical center had increased lately. When John Bin learned about the crown prince, he broke down in tears, saying he wanted to repay his kindness and say goodbye one last time. But when she was alive, she treated him cruelly and said horrible things. Jeonseong-oh told the princess about his plans to resign and abandon this position. Xia's eyes widened, and she asked the man if the crown prince did not desire that outcome, as if she understood everything due to her humble origin, meaning they wanted to poison the protagonist by giving her honey on purpose. But the man had served his highness for years, and now he cannot nor has the right to serve a new Lord Xia, heard that he risked his life and fought hard for the senior officer position. Suddenly, Jeonseong-oh revealed to the princess that the prince longed for her to grow. He pleaded with the lady to take care of herself, and the protagonist asked the officer to do the same for himself. Then they officially said goodbye to each other. The death of the crown prince was announced as an accident from a horsefall, but rumors were spreading recently. The gossiping maidservants whispered that a tiger ate someone, or that they heard strange voices. Beck begged the lady not to respond under any circumstances. If she suddenly heard a voice calling her, this means that whoever becomes the tiger's victim transforms into a slave who brings the prey. The protagonist turned sharply as soon as a voice called her name and asked who was there. From the shadows emerged a huge tiger. The court ladies grabbed the young princess and ran to get away from the beast. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening. Are there really ghosts in this world? The little one really understood. She could die if she stayed there. Our heroine wondered what she had done wrong in her life. The maid carrying the princess didn't see a stone in the darkness and tripped, losing her balance and falling to the ground right above her. The protagonist saw the paw of a huge beast and surprised a knife sticking out, but the tiger stopped dead in its tracks. Upon hearing the voices of the guards, the enormous predator turned and vanished into the darkness as Jefferson approached, or with a doctor to ask the princess if she was okay, and what those screams were. Lucky they arrived in time. The protagonist felt a bit calmer as the palace guard quickly ran towards the heroes. The maids wanted to explain the situation, but Xia ordered them to be quiet. The princess herself explained that a suspect had attacked them and then fled. As soon as they left, Beck asked his lady if they shouldn't inform the guards, but Xia replied that that voice was different. She wouldn't confuse her brother's voice in all that chaos. Only she could see it clearly, but the way the tiger moved wasn't natural. It moved as if a human were inside, and most importantly, in the moonlight, the princess saw something shine. They weren't beast claws, so this is the work of a human. It's rare for a girl to say that. If she had never offended anyone, and even gave her pay to those in need. Now the only way to save herself was to punish John Bean. But the protagonist didn't have time to think. Now everyone in the palace already knows that the crown prince died from an accident with a tiger, so the rumors will only get worse. Suddenly, Ami ran towards the princess, urgently begging her lady to go right now, to see her highness concubine June. It turns out the lady has started bleeding heavily. Amy grabbed the doctor by the hand and dragged him to the lady's chambers. In this recap manhwa, the protagonist, scared by everything happening, asked the maid what had happened for her mother to suddenly start bleeding before the lady. Had dinner and drank the medicinal infusion. Everything was fine with her, but suddenly, a young male voice resonated, calling for Lady June. The protagonist immediately asked if she was sure it was a human voice, and the court lady responded affirmatively. Then something strange attacked the lady, and she, very scared, fell, causing a hemorrhage. Xia didn't understand who dared to do something like that to her sister. It turns out that lately the lady had been saying that her belly had become like a stone. That's why the protagonist broke down crying inconsolably. The concubine went into shock and confused, asked the maids to calm the little lady. It was possibly due to worries about the crown prince, since she felt unwell throughout the ceremony after taking the medicinal potion. It only got worse, so Beck went to the royal hospital several times, but after examining her, they said it was just stress. Her sister's voice had never sounded so distressed. The birth was 3 months early, but if something goes wrong, not only will the baby suffer, but her sister's life will be in danger. The concubine kept screaming, and Xia could no longer bear to hear it. But suddenly the screams began to gradually fade. Torrential tears streamed from the protagonist's eyes upon hearing the doctor call for the lady in panic. The princess shot out instantly. She slammed the door open and saw terrified maids begging the lady to open her eyes. June slowly lifted her eyelids and looked at Xia. The protagonist touched her hand, and the woman whispered that she was so glad she had come. She was so happy to be close to her only daughter. In her last moment, the concubine's eyelids closed and her heart stopped beating. The protagonist hugged her sister and screamed desperately, not understanding why it had all ended this way. Both her brother and sister, for some reason.